Assalamu alaikum, and for those in California, it's good afternoon right now, as well as early evening for many parts of the country. Good evening, and assalamu alaikum. Welcome back. We'll give a few minutes for people to join. Those who have been Canada, Toronto, but it's from Wilfrid Laurier University. And I will give a full introduction as people join us. Welcome from those on Facebook, on the Islamophobia Studies Center Facebook, my own Facebook page, American Muslims for Palestine page, welcome, LinkedIn page, welcome. All those who are joining us from Twitter as well, make sure to tell us where you're watching from, and your connections and links that to both Islamophobia work and the broader discussion on the attack, demonization, and targeting of Muslims across the board. Also, those who are joining us on YouTube as well, welcome for those who are joining us. So really this discussion or this presentation by Professor Jasmine, who is doing two things. One, we're waiting for the upcoming book that is supposed to be released, and I'm looking forward to holding in my hand Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. It's from McGill Queen's University Press, and we're looking at it. It's a 6-year national study funded by the Social Sciences and Humanity Research Council. So I'm really looking forward to this book. It's really a groundbreaking study from Jasmine, but also within, I think by June 2022, we're going to have a comprehensive report on the Islamophobia industry in Canada. And in the earlier panel, some people were asking about cooperating and looking at the conditions of Islamophobia in Canada. And I'm really very happy that we will be partnering with Professor Jasmine Zain on the release of the report. It's very, very extensive, and it's a groundbreaking. Lastly, that Professor Jasmine is a colleague and co-builder of the International Islamophobia Studies and Research Association, ISRA. Jasmine and then Salman Sayed from Leeds, we've been the three co-partners in forming this association, and it's tremendous work. So welcome, Jasmine. It's really great to have you with us, and hopefully that the weather and conditions in Canada are not as impactful, because we heard that there's a massive storm coming. So hopefully all will be well. So welcome, and I'll give you the floor. Please take us through your own presentation, and I will make possible for you for the PowerPoint presentation as well.
Thank you so much, and greetings to everyone. Assalamu alaikum, welcome, afternoon, good evening, depending where you are. I really want to thank Hatem for creating this forum and these opportunities for us to gather and discuss, really important issues of Islamophobia globally. So I'm grateful to all of the hard work and effort that he puts in on behalf of the Islamophobia Studies Center. I would like to begin by letting you know that I'm joining you from the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Huron-Wendat, and Mississaugas of the Credit here on Turtle Island, also known as Canada. I want to begin by acknowledging the colonial legacies of violence against Indigenous people upon which our nation was built. So the conversation that I wanted to have with you today are a bit of a reflection on, and I guess we could start sharing that. Oh, yes, it's up there. Okay. On the contemporary registers of Islamophobia. Now, of course, that's a huge undertaking if we were talking about this as a global phenomenon, but I'm going to focus just a bit on the tip of the iceberg of these issues as they pertain to Canada, and I will make some connections to France where relevant as well. So let me see if I can advance this. I can't advance the slide, so maybe Let me just see. I don't know if someone on the back end could maybe advance the slide.
Once again, let me try to see if we'll advance it on our side. So just give me a minute.
Yes, thank you. I was just remarking on the fact of, you know, the issue of being a boomer and managing all of this technology. So we have to be a bit patient. Thank you for bearing with me on this. Okay. Let me see if I can. All right. I can't advance the slide. I'm hoping you can on your end. Perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to talk about three themes throughout this short presentation. The first, talking about secularism as a racial project. Secondly, exploring some biopolitical and civilizational discourses about Islamophobia. And third, talking about liberal forms of Islamophobia. Okay, next slide, please. So talking about secularism as a racial project, in Canada, secularism exists within white Francophone ethno-nationalism, and that has very much shaped the cultural politics within Quebec. Many years ago, Paul Gilroy described the new racism as being concerned with the mechanisms of belonging and banishment, or policing the boundaries of inclusion and exclusion, whereby people who, quote, whose origin, sentiment, or citizenship assigns them elsewhere. So this form of cultural racism employs the boundary markers of religion, culture, place of origin, and language, and so on, as part of the racialization of religions like Islam. Now, Etienne Baliber refers to how cultural racism is used to sort out the universal and progressive from the particularistic and the primitive. So in this sense, secularism masquerades as universal and progressive ideal. And as Talal Asad reminds us, it's not just a principle that's espoused by liberal democratic states, but it's also something that is socially and politically inscribed through a range of sensibilities. No, actually, I'm on the same slide, please. So in Quebec, those sensibilities have been shaped by ideas of pure laine, for one, which means in pure wool. And this speaks to the notions of racial and cultural purity that are linked to French white settlers. Also, the term Québécois de souche carries a similar connotation, establishing the genealogy of belonging as a birthright of old stock Canadians. And both of these ideas are part of Quebec's racial code and byproducts of white settler colonialism. And of course, these ideas erase Indigenous history and the legacies of colonial impositions and violence that shore up the racial hierarchy underwriting the nation, where now the presence of immigrant and refugee newcomers threaten what Gus and Hage talked about in White Nation as guardians of the national order. This terminology of Québécois de souche has been used by a far-right nationalist group, for example, called the Fédération de Québécois de souche, the FQS, as an anti-Muslim far-right group. So this idea still has particular resonance within Quebec society. Also, Quebec secularism became the means to identify and discipline unreasonable minorities from reasonable Québécois. based on culturally coded racial inscriptions. For example, there were debates on this notion of reasonable accommodation of religious minorities in Quebec, which resulted in provincial hearings and a report authored by the sociologist Charles Taylor and Gerard Bouchard, which the report itself and the proceedings largely sidestepped the issue of race within this kind of discussion, but it was definitely something that was underwriting both the idea of questioning the extent to which the state should be open to religious minorities and accommodating their interests, as well as the kind of dialogue and discourses that took place in public hearings and in the media. Many Quebecers felt that recalcitrant minorities and their demands for religious inclusion needed to be disciplined back into this assimilative grid of intercultural conformity, rather than the multicultural chaos that allows religious and cultural minorities to promote their illiberal and anti-democratic cultures at the expense of Canadian and Quebec values. So in both Quebec and in France, we see how religious freedom becomes sacrificed on this altar of secularism. Another example of that is what I call coerced unveiling policies and practices that lead to gendered forms of Islamophobia. And both of these policies and practices exist in Canada as well as in France. Now, in Canada, there's been more than a decade of efforts by the federal government and the Quebec provincial government to ban religious attire in the public sphere, particularly the hijab and niqab. First through Bill 94 in Quebec in 2010, which focused more on banning the niqab. In 2015, there was a federal attempt to ban the niqab during citizenship swearing-in ceremonies. And now at the current moment, Bill 21, or Quebec's secularism law, is now in effect, which prohibits religious attire for state employees such as prosecutors, teachers, police officers, under the guise of religious neutrality. Now, elsewhere, I've argued that these policies enact a form of sartorial nationalism, in which veiled Muslim women are rendered illiberal and unimaginable as citizens, and where national belonging begins to be determined sartorially through demonstrating allegiance to dominant secular values and beliefs. So now when these kinds of sentiments usher in coerced unveiling policies and practices, they're based on the problematic ways that Muslim women's religious attire has been regarded within the racial project of secularism as a sign of foreign, anti-modern, and anti-democratic religious sensibilities. One of the ironies of the present pandemic moment is that women in both Quebec and France are violating the law when they wear a face veil. They're wearing a niqab that covers their face. But if they cover their face with a PPE mask, they are good pandemic citizens. So this is some of the paradox of Islamophobia in the pandemic present. We can go to the next slide. Thank you. So, I was asked to talk about some of the tropes of Islamophobia. And, in the study that I'm doing on the Canadian Islamophobia industry, and I'm just finalizing a book-length report on this, which we hope will be released later this spring. One of the things that we were looking at in this project was documenting the kinds of discourses that circulate in Canada around Islamophobia. And this is just a few of them. And of course, these discourses exist internationally as well. But it's important, I think, to map their trajectory and genealogy within different geographic, cultural, and political contexts. So through these kinds of discourses and conspiracy theories, Muslims are cast as existential and cultural or civilizational threats. So we're familiar with this notion of the Muslim folk devil, or we should be in the sense, because this is how Muslims are constructed as a contemporary folk devil. More popular are the ideas of Muslims as security and terror threats. We're aware of the idea of the radical and the jihadist and the terrorist as being a essentialized trope within which Muslims are trying to navigate and work against. In particular, in my own work and my own research, Hatham mentioned my book, Under Siege, Islamophobia and the 9/11 Generation. I was really interested in how Muslim youth, in particular, this 9/11 generation, who've been socialized into a world that has been hallmarked by this global war on terror, where their identities have been cast as this, radical and jihadist, threat to the nation. And how do they navigate that particular world that has positioned them this way, and how does it affect them? And so that's something that I have spent a lot of time working on as well. Also, I think one of the most central tropes is this idea of the Islamist boogeyman. We've heard it from, the panelists this morning as well, speaking about how this manifests in the discourses of the far right, as well as in some of the more politically centered discourses, as being a significant trope of breeding Islamophobic fear and moral panic. This idea of the Muslim Trojan horse, which is represented in that image, the notion of Muslim invaders, the fifth column, are all tied back to the idea of the Islamist boogeyman. Even this neologism that has appeared in France of Islamoleftism is also tied back to this root as a way of talking about, the left as having this conspiratorial collusion with so-called Islamists who are part of this global conspiracy to overthrow the West and impose Sharia law and create a global caliphate. So this Islamic triumphalism, as it's often expressed. So the neologism Islamoleftism isn't used in Canada, but certainly the sentiments around it, particularly in terms of how left-leaning academics might be working in ways that are supporting Islamists, even in the fact that we challenge Islamophobia, right? It's one of those ways of showing, well, this is an invented concept, that was invented by these groups, and now these academics are supporting it. So that particular sentiment, if not the neologism, is certainly evident in some of the discourses we've seen in Canada, and no doubt elsewhere. Of course, the idea of creeping Sharia becomes that gateway and part of the global campaign to overthrow the West and impose Sharia law, which is, of course, only referenced on very extreme, miseducation about what Sharia is. The notion of taqiyya, we've also seen very much in some of the discourses in Canada, this idea that Muslims are being deceptive and are really wolves in sheep's clothing. And so that willful deception is also part of how they gain trust, and therefore leads to further suspicion and derision of Muslim communities. The notion of demographic replacement, which I think is quite global in its iterations and impact. We see this here as well in terms of concerns about Muslim populations and, the number of Muslim babies that are being born versus the, white population. And so, that type of demographic fear has also resonated in Canada. In particular, in 2007, there was an article written in the Maclean's magazine, a major national magazine, about this, fearing the future of Islam, and the idea that, Muslim youth are getting, are filling this gap of an otherwise aging white population, and are, hell bent on the destruction of the West. And so those kinds of, sort of biopolitical fears allow for the opening up of a surveillance society and state through practices of surveillance forms of governmentality, right? So again, these ideologies play very much into justifying state practices that we see as, throughout different global contexts, to regulate and police and surveil Muslims. Now, Muslim women play an interesting role in the discursive terrain, where Muslim women are both biopolitical and civilizational threats. So where Islam represents this cultural and civilizational threat to Western societies, Muslim women are recruited into that narrative both through their reproductive power, right, that plays into the kind of demographic fears. So their reproductive power is part of that biopolitical fear and the existential fears that come in, as well as how Muslim women's dress, as I mentioned before, is a signifier of the backwardness of Islam, its denigration of women, and the more visible aspect of Islam in the public sphere that also creates that sense of moral panic. So Muslim women play a dual role in terms of these kinds of discourses and how their bodies are deployed within that. And finally, the idea that Muslims are transgressive minorities, they're unwilling or unable to integrate into Western democratic societies, they're illiberal, anti-democratic, pre-modern. And then that is used as an example of the failure of multiculturalism, right? The inability to integrate Muslim communities into Western societies. So that's just a few of some of the discourses of Islamophobia that we've been sort of tracking in Canada. So I wanted to share some of that with you. We can move to the next slide. So part of what we've been doing with the Islamophobia industry study is to look at far-right white nationalist groups in Canada, of which there are about 300 of these groups. In the study that I've been doing on the Islamophobia industry, we've profiled about 30 far-right white nationalist groups that actively promote Islamophobia. Some of these groups have ties to their European counterparts, like Pegida, Soldiers of Odin, Generation Identity, Yellow Vests, and this Quebec-based group called La Meute, or the Wolf Pack, which has an origin and a counterpart in France. And so I've just put up some images here of their mission statement for France's La Meute, and some quotes that I'll just read out from both members of French La Meute and also Quebec's chapter. And so the mission that this group, their mandate is to fight to safeguard the French way of life, in particular concerning religious Islamism and the radicalization of society through the territory defense of secularism and the Republican way of life. If you go just to the far white circle, I'll read that next because that is from Quebec La Meute. And they offer similar ideology in terms of their group, saying that our democracy would be in danger because of radical Islam. Sharia would threaten us. Don't let those aggressors make Quebec a land of Islam. Let's wake up before we face our dead civil war and chaos. So you can really see the moral panic and existential threat that this discourse is meant to elicit, to gain followers and to build these anti-Muslim, anti-Islamophobic campaigns. And the one in the middle is a member of the France chapter of La Meute who says, I am in La Meute because if we do not regroup against the barbarian hordes, if we do not protect ourselves against religious fanaticism, if we do not fight against the planned invasion, we will not only lose our lives, but also our dear fatherland. La Meute, France, because there is still time. So you can really see how many of these groups are putting out a clarion call for their followers to gather around and protect their culture, their way of life from this encroachment of this Islamist, boogeyman that they are continuing to deploy. So I just wanted to give you a sense of this. Again, there's about 30 groups that we've been monitoring, looking at their discourses, their connections with other groups, their connections abroad. But I just chose this one since there is a direct connection to France. and just a bit of a sample of some of their rhetoric and their anti-Muslim rhetoric and the ways in which this operates to create conditions of Islamophobic fear and moral panic. Okay, next slide, please. So while I've spent a lot of time focusing on, the far right white nationalist groups that are part of a wider networked set of individuals, groups, think tanks that comprise the Islamophobia industry, along with the donors that support their campaigns, I don't want to, underestimate or not focus on the liberal forms of Islamophobia that exist. So I define this, and I'm talking about this in the context of Canada, as liberal forms of Islamophobia being part of the political mainstream, something that crosses all political categories and groups, where values of equity, diversity, inclusion, and multiculturalism are espoused and celebrated. Yet at the same time, state policies and practices are enacted that target Muslims as suspect and illiberal minorities, further authorizing and normalizing Islamophobia. Now, I argue that this happens at the nexus of Islamophilia and Islamophobia, where they converge. Islamophilia is marked by this cultural fascination and fetishism. And when it meets with Islamophobia, we have this nexus of multicultural desire and yet a racial and religious disavowal. So the paradox of these two contradictory impulses of fetishistic fascination and racial disavowal shapes the political and cultural terrain of multiculturalism. And I would argue that more than even some of these extreme variants of Islamophobia, liberal forms of Islamophobia do the work of normalizing anti-Muslim racism with greater legitimacy and institutional power. And therefore, through the state, it kind of provides a cover for these, a political cover for state practices. It uses multiculturalism as this political cover for state practices that are actually targeting Muslims. So some examples of just the photos I've put up, we see, for example, security policies that are, have been ushered in under, both liberal and conservative governments in this country that have, for example, things like security certificates. So when you see this image that says Guantanamo North, that's in reference to Millhaven Penitentiary, which held 5 Muslim men who were non-citizens, who were being held on security certificates, which are part of Canada's Immigration and Refugee Protection Act, and allow for indefinite detainment, indefinite detention, secret trials through which secret evidence can be brought to bear. And, this has really only been enacted against these 5 Muslim men who have been dubbed the Secret Trial 5 in Canada. And this is where they were held in the prison that was called Guantanamo North. We also see on the lower image this zero tolerance for barbaric cultural practices. Now, this was a federal policy that came in, and you can see from its framing, right, the idea of barbaric cultural practices is already using the idioms of colonial racism to articulate a particular kind of narrative. Because this policy was specifically about examining and identifying and combating issues of female genital mutilation, forced marriage, honor killing, all of which became associated with, Islamic cultures. And so that is a policy that has been renamed, but still exists in Canada. And at the time it was being ushered in, there was also a proposal for having a tip line where, if you thought barbaric cultural practices were happening in your neighborhood or, among people you knew, you could call in and report that. So this sort of snitch line was something that was promoted, but actually did not come into being. There are also policies such as no-fly lists and so on, where Muslims are being tracked and surveilled in terms of crossing borders. There were even Muslim toddlers whose names ended up on this no-fly list. So within this sort of liberal state that espouses multiculturalism, we have these particular kinds of policies that are targeting Muslim populations, and creating this sort of Islamophilia on the one hand, where we need to celebrate Muslims and what they bring to our society and have Islamic History Month, and on the other hand have these very draconian policies that are specifically targeting Muslims under the cover of multicultural civility. So I'm going to just stop here, and I'm happy to answer any questions later on. Thank you. Sorry, I had one more slide, and it's an important one, because I would be remiss if I didn't mention that Islamophobia has deadly consequences in this country. In a couple of weeks, we will be at the 5th year anniversary of the Quebec mosque attack on January 29th. And after the anniversary last year, just a few months later, on June 6th, 2021, there was another terror attack against Muslims in London, Ontario. And so we have faced two major attacks against Muslims in this country at the hands of those who have white nationalist sensibilities. And, this is an important and terrible and tragic reminder of the deadly consequences of Islamophobia, and how all of these ingredients that I've been speaking of, and there are many others as well, create the conditions for this particular kind of Islamophobic violence to become authorized and perpetrated. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jasmine. And for sure, there will be further discussion as your book gets published and the report. And I promise you that we will have a dedicated session for the release of the report on Canada. It's really a pleasure for us to have you with us, and inshallah next time it will be in person that we'll be able to meet. So I'm going to bring up Huzaifa Shahbaz. Welcome. Assalamu alaikum, Huzaifa.
Alaikum salam.
Good. So it's good to have you with us. And Jasmine, we'll try to put you back into the studio. So good to have you, and stay safe, inshallah. So Huzaifa is a graduate of the GTU, Graduate Theological Union, where we had him here next to us, working with our dear colleague Munir Jiwa, where he has done his work under him. But now he moved to being in the director of the Islamophobia office, maybe project at CARE, Council on American Islamic Relations. And this past week, they just released their new report on Islamophobia in the United States. And I wanted Huzaifa to take the time to give us some of the key takeaway from this report. We have partnered with CARE in the past on at least 3 of their previous reports. And it's really good to see this work continues. That gives a context to Islamophobia in the United States. So Huzaifa, go ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hatem, for inviting me, and for obviously all the work that you do to bring scholars and activists together to talk about critical issues facing the Muslim community. I think I want to just start by sharing my screen so I can maybe show the report to people. And I can go through it with the audience. So let me just take a second to share that. Okay.
Are you?
Changing 2 monitors. Okay. Could you see that, Dr. Hatem? The report? Yeah. Perfect. Okay, great. So this report is called Islamophobia in the Mainstream. And so the goal of this report was to assess the extent of Islamophobia in 2019 and 2020. And so we wanted to look at 5 different aspects. Number 1 was the funding behind the US Islamophobia network. Second is school bullying statistics. Number 3 was Islamophobia and social media. 4 is anti-mosque incidents. And lastly, we wanted to look at Islamophobia and American politics, how congressional members Muslim congressional members are facing Islamophobia, and how there's anti-Muslim rhetoric within US Congress, particularly from the Republican Party. And so, in this report, overall, we had exposed nearly $106 million into 26 US Islamophobia network groups between 2017 to 2019. And we detail more than a dozen anti-mosque incidents and Islamophobia within our schools, politics, and social media. And so now I'm going to just maybe go over the selected key findings from our report and some notes I do really want to share with you all. Okay, I'm just going to scroll down to key findings here. And so the first 3 I do want to share with you all is number 1, among the top 50 largest charitable institutions and foundations we reviewed from our previous report, actually Hijacked by Hate, 35 of them funneled a combined total of nearly $106 million into 26 Islamophobia network groups. Number 2, Christian Advocates Serving Evangelism, Fidelity Charitable Gift Fund, which is a donor-advised fund, Schwab Charitable Fund, which is also a donor-advised fund, and the Marcus Foundation, the Adelson Family Foundation, and the Jewish Communal Foundation, which is also a DAF, were among the top 6 funders of the US Islamophobia network between 2017 and 2019. Number 3, the American Center for Law and Justice received a combined total of over $60 million from the Christian Advocates Serving Evangelism between 2017 and 2019. And for folks who don't know, the ACLJ has a history of supporting anti-Muslim policies like the Muslim ban. For example, in 2017, the ACLJ filed a supporting court brief in defense of the Muslim ban. Number 4, scare school bullying reports that we reviewed from select states demonstrate that students continue to face physical and verbal abuse for being Muslim and do not feel comfortable expressing their Muslim identity and engaging in classroom discussions about Muslims and Islam. And so in this portion, in this section of the report, we examined the CARE school bullying reports that we do across the states. So we looked at Texas, we looked at Massachusetts, and we looked at CARE California bullying reports to see what are the similar kinds of trends and themes that we're noticing across the spectrum. Number 5, we looked at anti-mosque incidents between 2019 and 2020. So we identified 16 anti-mosque incidents, including incidents of damage, destruction, and vandalism, also known as DDV, intimidation, and harassment. And again, we have to keep in mind that many people do not report these incidences. And so we do expect this number to actually be much higher. Number 6, between 2019 and 2020, we identified 40 instances where institutional leaders shared or posted anti-Muslim content online. And so we define institutional leaders as individuals who hold a position of influence or power within our trusted institutions. So that may be a school board member, for example, or a police chief. And so we identified 40 instances on social media where these individuals were expressing explicit anti-Muslim content online. And then lastly, we looked at a examination of Islamophobia in American politics, and we found that 7 individuals with a history of Islamophobia were either appointed or nominated to serve in the Trump administration. And so now I just want to transition into some notes and some of the numbers that we found looking at the donor advised funds and the funding. And so I first want to go over maybe talking about, for folks who don't know, what is a donor advised fund? And so a donor advised fund is is distinct from a private foundation or a public charity. At its core, it's a contractual relationship between the donor and the fund that guarantees donors an immediate tax write-off in exchange for their contribution, with no requirement that any of the contribution be put to active charitable use. The largest donor-advised funds in the country are administered through the charitable arms of major investment firms like Fidelity and Schwab. And although a donor can suggest where they would like their money to be directed, the fund has ultimate authority in how to dole out the assets, as each DAF has distinct criteria regarding which organizations it chooses to fund. So you take, for example, someone like David Horowitz, who's a well-known anti-Muslim bigot. He runs the David Horowitz Freedom Center. He goes to a place like Fidelity or Schwab. He can open up a donor-advised fund and remain anonymous and continue to pour millions of dollars to other anti-Muslim groups, and nobody would know that was David Horowitz, right? And so that is the kind of challenges that donor-advised funds are facing, and what many critics are saying that needs to be reformed. And we'll talk more about this in a little bit. And so what is the overall impact of this network, right? So there are a few things. One, there's a spreading of false information about Muslim communities in the United States and beyond through social media, press, public hearings, and other avenues. Two, there's supporting policies that negatively impact Muslim communities in the United States and overseas, such as the Muslim ban. And three, there's a violent targeting of local Muslim communities through anti-Sharia demonstrations and anti-mosque attacks. And four, special interest lobbying by leaders of anti-Muslim hate groups. So Frank Gaffney, as many of you may know, is the founder of the Center for Security Policy, designated anti-Muslim hate group by SPLC, or the Southern Poverty Law Center. He was actually appointed to Ted Cruz's foreign policy team in 2016. And so, again, you can see directly how the Islamophobia network is working directly with Republican politicians. And so here we, just lay out the 35 foundations that have funneled money into anti-Muslim hate groups. And so as you can see here, I just want to point out a few things. So as many of you know, Adelson Family Foundation is very well known for pouring money into anti-Muslim groups and to pro-Israel advocacy groups as well. And so the Adelson Family Foundation, for example, gave nearly $4 million to Islamophobia network groups between 2017 to 2019. And the foundation also gave a combined $3 million to the Middle East Media Research Institute, also known as MEMRI, between 2017 to 2019. So MEMRI, for those who don't know, has an established reputation for distributing highly selective, distorted, and inaccurate translations of Arabic and Persian media. And through these selections, the organization attempts to portray Muslims as inherently irrational, violent, prone to terrorism, basically hits all of the Orientalist tropes that we know of today. And actually, a minor study was done by CNN's Arabic program, and they found massive problems with MEMRI's translations of their programs. Fidelity Charitable poured close to $7 million into Islamophobia network groups between 2017 and 2019. And it gave the American Freedom Law Center $1.2 million. And as a reminder, American Freedom Law Center is founded by David Yerushalmi, who drafted the American Laws for American Courts, which has served as a model for the enactment of 18 anti-Muslim laws in states in the U.S. between 2010 and 2016, the anti-Sharia bills that we know about. And so, while some of these funds and private family foundations are ideologically aligned with anti-Muslim hate groups like the Adelson Family Foundation, it's also important to recognize that donor-advised funds are being exploited and abused by donors who seek to anonymize their contributions to anti-Muslim special interest groups to receive tax benefits, right? But however, on the other side, we have to keep in mind that these donor-advised funds have known for years about this activity. You can go as far as back as when the first report on the Islamophobia network came about, I think Fear Inc. In the early 2000 mid-2000s, or I believe. And so again, they've known about it for years, but we haven't necessarily seen the appropriate policy changes to alleviate some of these issues. And so, however, there is some work being done around this. We have the Action Center on Race and the Economy, which has done a campaign called the Unmasking Fidelity Coalition and the Hate is Not Charitable campaign. They're leading this effort to hold Fidelity accountable for contributing to organizations who have supported to anti-Muslim and even white supremacist and fascist movements that were responsible for the January 6th attack. And so I think to close on some of the recommendations for this portion, I think there are some really important things to keep in mind here. One is that charitable institutions should implement clear anti-hate policies and procedures to ensure funds are not granted to hate groups. Number two, interfaith communities and religious institutions should design and implement faith-based programs dedicated to marginalizing hate speech and anti-Muslim bigotry in local communities. Number three, philanthropic institutions should familiarize staff and stakeholders with major actors and influencers in the Islamophobia network. So maybe partnering with institutions that do this kind of work like CARE, CAP, whoever it may be, to really familiarize staff with who are these actors in the Islamophobia network, what kind of misinformation are they putting out about Muslims and Islam. Number four, organizations should investigate their grant-making procedures to learn if they're intentionally or unintentionally funneling money to Islamophobia network groups. And lastly, philanthropic and religious institutions should hold educational initiatives for staff and board members to understand the scope of anti-Muslim bigotry and what constitutes Islamophobia. And so that's the portion on donor-advised funds and funding. And I know I have only 15 minutes, so I'm just going to quickly go over the rest here. And so the next section we did Islamophobia and school bullying. Here we found, again, our key finding here was that CARE school bullying reports from select states demonstrates that students continue to face physical and verbal abuse for being Muslim and do not feel comfortable expressing their Muslim identity and engaging in classroom discussions about Muslims and Islam. One report, for example, found that 48% of respondents of a survey experienced some type of bullying, including verbal insults, physical abuse, and cyberbullying. And so that's kind of what this section is about. You can look at some of the key findings from our CARE Texas report, our CARE Massachusetts report, and we also have personal stories by Muslims in their own words. So one person, for example, here said that they, meaning the teachers and administrators, know what's going on, but they try and cover it up. My freshman year, I got bullied a lot, and the administrator told my mom we should just move to Cambridge. I was in middle school, one guy tugged on my hijab, and I was too scared to tell anyone. And so these are the kinds of things that we're unfortunately hearing from students, despite the many years of Islamophobia research that has been done. And the next section here was anti-mosque incidents. And so here we broke it down into three categories. So that was damage, destruction, and vandalism, harassment, and intimidation. And again, this is not representative at all of the many other cases that may be out there, but we just went off of what was reported to us and what we were able to identify. And so we found, one incident of harassment, and looking at 2019 and 2020, 6 incidences of intimidation, and 10 incidences of damage, destruction, and vandalism. And then next, we look at Islamophobia and social media. And so this is something new that we've done here. And the purpose here was to look at how do institutional leaders, people that we trust to be impartial actors, how do they engage in anti-Muslim bigotry, right? And what are some examples and instances we can point to? And so between 2019 and 2020, we identified 40 instances where institutional leaders shared or posted anti-Muslim content online. And we define institutional leaders as individuals who hold a position of influence or power within our trusted institutions. So that may be a school board member or a police chief. And so, one individual here, Ted House, he's a Republican. He was a Republican in May 2020, who was challenging a Democratic Josh Harder in a battleground district in California in 2020. He had deleted social media posts and retweets that described Islam as a death cult and the Prophet Muhammad as a quote-unquote rapist and pedophile. And there are many. So if you can see here, there are many examples you can run through here by city and then the month and then the year it occurred. And just lastly, to close, we did a section on Islamophobia and American politics. And so here we identified 7 individuals with a history of Islamophobia who were either appointed or nominated to serve in the Trump administration. So one example was in April 2020 when President Trump appointed Kayleigh McEnany as the White House press secretary, who actually has a long history of defending and promoting anti-Muslim bigotry. In 2014, she participated in a Fox Business News segment titled "How Big of a Threat is Islam?", in which she sat alongside white supremacist Proud Boys co-founder Gavin McInnes, and she repeatedly hyped the threat of extremism among Muslims, while McInnes argued that Muslims are prone to violence because of genetic defects caused by inbreeding. In 2016, she wrote on Twitter, "Obama endlessly preaches tolerance of Islam, but never mentions Christian genocide of Christians in Iraq." And she even wrote an op-ed in The Hill decrying far left, quote unquote, far left German Chancellor Angela Merkel and European nations for allowing Muslim refugees to enter their borders, which McKinney claimed resulted in a culture in crisis, a culture without democratic, freedom-loving identity, and constantly under murderous attacks from Kansas within. So pretty horrendous stuff here, and you can definitely check those out within our report. And this report wouldn't be complete without mentioning Marjorie Taylor Greene, who also has a history of anti-Muslim rhetoric. She, in reference to the 2018 midterms, for example, she stated that it was part of an Islamic invasion of our government and that anyone that is a Muslim and believes in Sharia law does not belong in our government. So basically referencing, people like Ilhan Omar, Rashida Tlaib, Andre Carson, and things of that sort. So that's our Islamophobia and American politics section. And we really hope to, build off of this work to see how much more funding is increasing. How can we work with the philanthropic community to, implement policies to ensure money is not going into a lot of these anti-Muslim hate groups. And we really want to work on also, working with maybe congressional members as well to shed light on some of the anti-Muslim activity that has happened within our government. So that pretty much sums it up, and I think that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Hudhaifa. This is just an important report building up on the research, the knowledge about the Islamophobia industry, but more importantly, the funding that increasingly has been straddled through these institutions, investment institutions, Fidelity and others, where you are unable to really identify who's funding this bigotry and hate in the country, and then also identifying the various manifestation of Islamophobia, especially within the political establishment. I do think that the Republican Party in particular, and not to give the Democrats a pass, but the Republican Party in particular have really provided a hospitable environment, and if anything, have used Islamophobia as a rallying point to monetize it as votes at the ballot box. And we could trace some of that from the way back from 2018 of using Islamophobia to target the presidential candidate Obama at the time, and then making it all the way into the mainstream. And I also remind people about the that the initial attacks on Obama first came from Hillary Clinton campaign, a Democrat herself, that released the images of Obama dressed in the traditional Kenyan outfit as a nod to his un-American identity, and in essence saying that he is a Muslim or a closet Muslim. So definitely the research is badly needed, and continue to build on this steady research in relations to Islamophobia. So really thank you for coming and presenting the report, and I put the report in the links, so please make sure to access it, to share it with your colleagues. If you are teaching, actually use it as a tool for teaching. Share it with your representatives at the local level, city council, congressional, senate, and so on. So this is the value of such an important material at this time. So we'll say salams to Huzaifa, and hopefully we'll see you in person in the future. And now we're going to shift into our last panel to have a discussion with our 4 presentations that are coming in a few minutes. So we'll say salam, and we'll get you back out to the studio. Okay, so welcome. We're still in here. We had Jasmine that finished presenting, and Huzaifa, who presented on the report in of the United States. And we have 4 speakers, and I'm waiting for 2 more to join us on the studio in the next few minutes. So as we are continuing to discuss, we're going to start at 2 o'clock, the next presentations. So hopefully we'll wait for a couple of minutes. And in the meantime, I'll just give, again, the updates. We are expecting to have the report on Canada to be published in June, and that will be a full report. But also for those who are continuing to connect to our work, the International Islamophobia Studies and Research Association will be launching its founding conference in May, in the 2nd week of May, 12th, 13th, 14th of May. And this will be an academic association that will bring together the scholars from across the globe, hopefully, that will participate. The association is already registered as a full academic association with a nonprofit status. It has already a governing board with individuals from US, Canada, Europe, Japan, and hopefully we'll look at other participants to join this emerging academic institution in order to formalize the field of Islamophobia studies. So that's something that is coming, and I see that Sana has joined us. So I'm going to bring everybody up to the stream. And hopefully we're waiting for Uzma. So assalamu alaikum, and good afternoon, good evening, Sana, Andrea. It's welcome to see you, Philip. It's good to see you. I know that we are in different time zones. So I'll just give a quick introduction in just 1 minute as soon as we get. Uzma, it's good to see you, Uzma. You're with us. I was looking and seeing. So it's really great to have 4 of you with us today. So I'm just going to jump immediately so we have as much time as possible. So our first presentation is going to come from Andrea Meza Torres. Torres is a PhD from the Institute for European Anthropology in Humboldt University, Berlin. So we welcome you to this conversation. And her presentation is a critique of the discourse of French société in contemporary France. So again, this notion of secularism, la société that has been used in France. So Andrea, the floor is yours, and you could take us through your presentation. And make sure that your mic is on. Are you with us? Andrea? We're all using the technology and not only sheltering in place, but we're all are, we could qualify to be in the Geek Squad at Best Buy if our research field does not materialize. So, Andrea, are you with us, or should we maybe? Yes.
Yes. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can. So, oops. Go ahead. I don't know if it's your connection that's a little bit slow.
Can you hear me? I can't.
Oh, she dropped from the. Maybe we could shift to our second speaker until we get this connection filled. Dr. Uzma, are you able to possibly start? So it's
if Umar has the PowerPoint ready.
Yes. So we have your presentation ready, and it appears on the screen. First, let me welcome you, Dr. Uzma Jamil. Not only a scholar, but a dear friend that's been connected to the work of Islamophobia for quite a long time, both in here as well as in Europe. Dr. Jamil's research is in critical Muslim studies, with a focus on Muslims as a racialized and religious minorities in Quebec and Canada. She's connected to the Islamophobia Studies Journal, Reorient, the Critical Muslim Studies. So it's really a pleasure to have you with us. So, Uzma, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you, Hatem. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you to Hatem for inviting me. Thank you to Umar for technical support. And thank you to my colleagues here who are part of this conference today. I'm looking forward to our conversation a little bit later. So my paper today is thinking about the transnational connections of Islamophobia, whiteness, and coloniality between France and Quebec. Could you pass to the next slide, please? So like many people who live here in Quebec, I've been observing, the Islamophobic discourses that have been ongoing in France for any number of years, and seeing how they've been replicated.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. Seeing how they've been replicated here, echoing in Quebec's political discourses as well. So these discourses, in addition to sort of doing the job of fear-mongering, are primarily focused on regulating Muslimness in public and private spaces of the French nation, loosely defined. And the preoccupation with maintaining French Republican identity seems to be equaled only by the commitment to uphold French laïcité, by countering the quote-unquote separatist threat posed by Muslims as a result of their religious identity. While this preoccupation and the laws are longstanding, the most recent legislative intervention has been in the form of the separatism law, which was passed last year. Meanwhile, in Quebec, a French-speaking province of a country that is officially bilingual, but is in practice an English-speaking majority, there seem to be parallels in legislative attempts over the past decade. Various governing parties have tried to pass their versions of a hijab or a niqab ban in the name of Quebec's national values, particularly around gender equality and secularism, as part of a modern, post-Quiet Revolution Quebecois national identity. These proposed bills are preoccupied with the imagined loss of Quebec's national identity at the hands of two groups, immigrants and Muslims, generating a lot of xenophobic and Islamophobic debate. However, none of them were successful until 2019, when the ruling CAQ party, led by Premier François Legault, succeeded in passing Bill 21 into law. It targets the giving and receiving of public services by people who wear visible religious symbol, a phrase that has echoes in France for many people who have been following what's been happening there. In practice, this law disproportionately affects Muslim women who wear hijabs or niqabs, as well as other religious minorities, both inside and outside of Quebec, and has generated protests and legal challenges, the latter of which are still ongoing. So I begin this paper with a fairly straightforward question. How do we think about the connection in Islamophobic discourses and laws in France and Quebec? So next slide, please. The Muslim-nation relationship is usually the primary frame for discussing Islamophobia and Muslim minorities in Western countries. It creates a temporal boundary, assuming that the modern iteration of the Western nation is in fact the quote-unquote beginning, for understanding how Muslims have come to be excluded from it today and all the many implicit and explicit ways that this is carried out. It also relies on a common understanding of Muslims as racialized immigrants to underline their recent, usually post-World War II, arrival into the nation, and therefore they're also their inherent difference from it. They are seen as foreigners who must be taught to become citizens of this nation, and their essentialized difference is articulated through the binaries and hierarchies of Orientalism, the so-called civilized and rational superiority of Western society vis-a-vis the barbaric, irrational, and uncivilized inferiority of Islam and Muslims. These categories of essentialized difference make it possible to not only portray Muslims as a problem, but also places the burden on them to let go of their Muslimness if they wish to belong or to quote-unquote integrate into the Western nation. Lastly, this frame allows the fight for the protection of Muslim rights and freedoms as citizens and as members of the polity to remain confined and therefore dislocated from the larger colonial history that defines the present-day relationship between white majorities and racialized non-white minorities. As an aside, I want to clarify that in this paper, I'm using the nation or national identity to refer to the imagined community that constitutes a nation in France or in Quebec, while also recognizing that Quebec is a province within Canada. And so therefore, national identity is not synonymous with state sovereignty in the comparisons between Quebec and France. Slide. In this paper, then, I propose to look at the logics of coloniality that inform the relation between Muslims and the West, broadly speaking, which incorporate the Muslim-Western nation relationship, but it is not limited to it. This allows us then to look both behind and beyond the nation, to examine histories and politics of the colonial past and the post-colonial present on a wider scale and as overlapping threads rather than as a linear or causal relation. This reframing to focus on the racialized logics of coloniality places Muslims then within a longer history of European settlement in the Americas, as well as in relation to the idea of the West. It allows us to see Islamophobia, as Sayed describes, quote, systematic regulation and disciplining of Muslimness by reference to a westernizing horizon, end quote. In particular, it allows us to examine how the logics of coloniality and whiteness are part of both the history and the ongoing relationship between France and Quebec today. Quebec is a white settler society that was once part of La Nouvelle France, French colonial settlement that stretched from Louisiana in the southern US all the way up north to what is now the province of Quebec and parts of Atlantic Canada. So my presentation today is 3 parts. First, I'll outline very briefly the colonial history between France and Quebec. Second, then I'll discuss how language, race, and religion shape both Quebec's colonial past and its implications for its relation to Muslims today. Just hang on a second before we get to that slide. And lastly, I will discuss how logics of coloniality and whiteness are relevant for understanding Islamophobia in France and Quebec today, and then conclude by reflecting on the implications of the Muslim-West political divide. Now slide. Thank you. So this is a very brief timeline that is sort of the standard for talking about French colonial settlement in Quebec, with dates of the key moments of arrival by French settlers. It reflects the Quebec national imaginary, which traces back the present-day province of Quebec to these approximately 200 years that make it distinct within the settler colonial history of Canada. So I want to underline 3 points here about the significance of this particular history. First, that it obscures the presence of Indigenous communities who lived on these lands for hundreds of years before European settlers arrived. The settler colonial narrative begins with this idea of terra nullius, empty land, justifying its subsequent colonization and settlement. The racialized hierarchy of the settler colonial project was created, in fact, through the killing and removal of Indigenous peoples from their lands, a dispossession that continues in many forms today. Second, in contemporary Canadian national imaginary, even if the English and the French are seen as founding peoples, as Sunera Tobani describes them, in Quebec, this is not the case. In Quebec, this particular relationship is not equal. There is a hierarchy in which Quebec is considered to be subordinate in relation to English Canada. And this moment can be traced back to 1763, when the French lost to the British at the end of the Seven Years' War. The resonance of this event is known as La Conquête in Quebec, and it continues into the present day. Lastly, this history forms the basis for French as the hallmark of Quebec's national identity, where French signifies any number of things: a language, a shared cultural identity, shared religious history, and a group of defining a group of people as a distinct community. It also forms the basis for the fear of the loss of French language and identity as a minority French-speaking province in a majority English-speaking Canada. Slide. So, beginning with language then, which is a primary marker of Quebec national identity. Quebec's role as a member of the La Francophonie connects France to the including Quebec, illustrates the symbolic significance of language on a global level, as well as illustrating how this relationship endures in the post-colonial present. French, internally speaking, French is particularly important as a selection criterion for immigration to Quebec. And as an aside, Quebec has its own immigrant selection process in addition to the federal Canadian one. In practice, this means that people who are French-speaking are given preference within the system, especially people who come from former French colonies in the Middle East, North Africa, West Africa, and East Asia. Since the 1990s, a special agreement with France means that French citizens have a fast track for moving to Quebec to work, to study, or to settle as immigrants. Why is this significant? Because the people who have benefited from this include Muslims who were part of the former French colonies in North Africa. So the majority of Muslims who live here in Quebec today are Francophone. The majority of them are also Arab. And the same Muslims then who will make up the idea of the Muslim community in France are the same Muslims then who are also here as well. In the 1990s, most of them came from Algeria and Morocco, but more recently they come from France because of the special agreement between Quebec and France. So technically then, as French-speaking migrants to Quebec, they should fit right in, right? And despite the preference given to them, they should be doing better here than everybody else. Yet, most of the xenophobic discourses around immigrants as foreigners and cultural threats focuses actually on their lack of French integration. And the reality is that many of the Francophone Muslims who do live here are subject to systemic discrimination and employment, something which Bill 21 only increases. Thus, the majority of Muslims who ought to fit into Quebec, if Quebec is to be defined primarily through French, are excluded from it. Slide. So this brings us then to consider the role of religion, and in particular, the role of the Catholic Church. It's played a very strong role in Quebec since the colonial period. If you think back to the timeline, the Company of New France, which was created in order to send settlers, encourage them to come to New France, only offered places to French Catholics. So from the very beginning, this community was defined in a very particular way. The church benefited from land grants given by the French king and the colonial administration. It established schools, seminaries, convents, and missions, religious institutions that had great power in Catholic society. When the French left in 1763, the British colonial administration allowed the church to continue to function fairly independently in return for its support for the political legitimacy of colonial authorities. However, French Catholics were treated negatively as a racialized and religious minority by English Protestants who held all the positions of governing authority. This history then was ostensibly rejected in the Quiet Revolution of the 1960s, when the expansive role of the Catholic Church in Quebec City was secularized, and the state took over the functions that the church had previously undertaken, including education, healthcare, social welfare, etc. This coincided then with the development of a Quebecois political identity as well. And the profound social, political, and cultural shift that was part of this process was replaced then by secularism as a Quebec national value and part of its modern, quote unquote, identity as a society. So I'd suggest then that the space that religion, and specifically Catholic Church, took up was now replaced with perhaps an equally weighted and passionate attachment to laïcité. And in order for this distinction to be politically meaningful, where English Protestants were no longer the other group against which French Catholicism needed to be defined, it required Muslims as both civilizational and religious others of the non-West in order for this secularism to be meaningful. So Muslims in Quebec may well be Francophones because they're also former French colonial subjects. But the haunting specter of the Catholic Church in Quebec means that Muslims remain suspect because of their religious identity. Slide. The third marker then is race, and referring specifically to whiteness. The history of colonial settlement is kept alive through a nation imagined as a family. Thanks to the church records, it is possible for white French Quebecois to trace their genealogical roots back to the original 10,000 French settlers. The Québécois de souche claim this heritage then as a point of pride, often as a way to underline the exclusion of immigrants from the literal white nation. The recognition of the racial roots then, connecting a claim to the land with the Québécois as a community, is also kept alive in other ways. So this example then is of a poster in the Montreal Metro. Ostensibly, it's an advertisement for cheese that are made in Quebec. And it's meant to encourage local, people to buy from local businesses. However, the language that is used here, I confirm that they are from here, je vérifie qu'ils sont d'ici, is also a gesture towards the exclusion of racialized immigrants and Muslims who are non-white, non-French, Quebecois. The unspoken but nevertheless recognizable message is that they are not from here. Thus, the long-standing ties that bind France and Quebec are seen not only as uninterrupted across time, but also exclusive, racially speaking. Tying these together then with the role of religion, as I mentioned earlier, French settlers were all Catholic. It means that Muslims today interrupt both the racial and the religious contours of a nation imagined as white, French, and not Catholic / secular. Slide. So now I'm at the third part of my presentation, and I want to talk about two different logics here that intersect. And referring back to the definition that I used earlier from Salman Sayed's work around the regulation and disciplining of Muslimness. So the intersection of the logics of whiteness and coloniality creates a racialized hierarchy that favors political control and rule of white over non-white groups, as Charles Mills has noted. This is mapped onto a moral cultural hierarchy of the civilized white Europeans over the uncivilized non-white natives, or the quote-unquote barbarians of the Orient, as Edward Said has discussed in his work on Orientalism. State-sponsored Islamophobia in France and Quebec reflects the tension of these two logics in its attempt to discipline and regulate Muslimness and the Muslim population in each of these societies. So on one hand, there is the desire to erase all visible markers of Muslimness in public space in the name of state-determined secularism, or laïcité, as well as claims to uphold gender equality. This makes the visible markers of Muslim religiosity not only exceptional, but also illegal. Thus, the weight of the laws which prohibit Muslim women from wearing a hijab or niqab in schools, universities, and workplaces is to remove them from these spaces, or at the very least, remove their visibility. Muslim women can remain if they choose to become invisible, as in look like any other French or Quebecois woman who is studying or working in these spaces. Slide. This desire to unveil Muslim women has colonial antecedents during French rule in Algeria, where unveiling was discursively framed as the vehicle for assimilation into being French and being civilized. And Muslim women were either persuaded, paid, or forced to remove their veils, according to one researcher, and where their emancipation then was necessary as a way to maintain control over the quote-unquote native population. Thinking about what's happening in Quebec today with Bill 21 and its application in December, a Muslim elementary school teacher was removed from her position because she wears a hijab. And all of the politicians kind of got involved in this public conversation about it. And one of the MNAs from the ruling CAQ party stated that she was not removed because of her hijab. Rather, she was given the choice to remove her religious symbol, and she refused to obey the law. In other words, the problem was not the law, but the fact that she chose to disobey it. So if she had removed her hijab, she would have blended in, she would have not been visible. Going one step further, the Parti Québécois politician Pascal Bérubé supported the CAQ position, stating that the teacher was in fact using her hijab to make a statement. So it's not even that she was wearing a hijab and it happened to be visible. She was actively making a statement, allegedly, and therefore didn't deserve any sympathy from the public because Quebec was allegedly a secular society. This replication then of colonial logic and the contemporary laws that seek to erase Muslim presence from the public sphere, where it is understood as symbolic of French or Quebecois nation. They may be framed through different narratives, ones that glorify, for example, the French Republic rather than the Empire or Quebec secular society. Nevertheless, the outcomes end up being the same. Slide. So if we think about this logic of erasure and we carry this just a little bit further, it creates a bit of a problem because theoretically, once the law is applied, all visible Muslim women should become invisible, as in they should blend into the population. The boundaries of the nation should therefore be secured, its homogeneity and unity would be preserved and protected, and thus the political fault line between the us of the nation and the them of the Muslims should dissolve. But of course, this is not what actually happens, because there is also a very strong desire by the state to have control over Muslim populations and not just to erase their Muslimness. The political fault line between Muslims and the nation is necessary for that to happen. It's what makes it possible for Muslims and their alleged separatism to be a threat. In other words, the erasure of Muslimness would mean that Muslim populations no longer needed to be controlled, and therefore they didn't need to be identified in the first place. Of course, to the contrary, there are examples in the French case of Macron's attempt to create a state-controlled Islam, in a similar way to what's been happening in Germany and Austria, as my colleagues this morning were talking about. So the adoption of a charter of what was once called the Charter of Republican Values, renamed as a Charter of Principles, is meant to be a loyalty test. It's a declaration of loyalty from imams in return for state recognition. It clearly places Muslim religiosity in a subordinate position to Republican citizenship. This is a point of difference then with Quebec, because even though the government has succeeded in passing Bill 21, it has first of all done so by using the notwithstanding clause, which allows it to bypass the regular ability for the Canadian Charter to be evoked in order to challenge it. Second of all, there is no equivalent body of Muslim associations, and nor does the government seem to indicate any desire to have control over religious institutions. Nevertheless, the idea that the loyalty of Muslims in Quebec is suspect only because they are Muslim is still pretty much the same and is easily recognizable in these echoes. The frequent iteration of Quebec values, most infamously in the Charter of Quebec Values that the PQ put forward in 2013, lets us see that these echoes are ongoing. So putting forward these two tensions, the logic of erasure and the logic of control, if there's this tension between the desire to erase Muslimness and the desire to control Muslimness, how can it be resolved? Slide. By refusing to acknowledge it. Many of the people who have criticized Islamophobic laws under discussion here have done so by naming them as such, pointing out that they are specifically discriminating against Muslims. And this seems to be a rather mundane and self-evident point, but the politicians behind these laws have sidestepped the problem by naming their Islamophobia as something else, as a commitment to secularism, commitment to Republican values, to national security, etc. In other words, by not naming it or by not acknowledging Islamophobia, this continues to place the burden on Muslims and their organizations that are affected by the laws to prove that they are Islamophobic. And that becomes the first condition in order for any potential or subsequent redress from that law. And there, in the meantime, it allows politicians and the government to carry on doing what they are doing. So this is what allows then François Legault to insist that there is no Islamophobia in Quebec, despite the Quebec City mosque shooting that took place in 2017, and for which we're coming up on the 5th anniversary later this month. In the meantime, however, he persists in emphasizing that Quebec is a secular society where Bill 21 was passed by the majority, as if it could be any law interchangeable with any secular Western democratic society. Similarly, France's insistence on colorblindness and his understanding of citizenship means that there is no official recognition of religion or race as categories by the state. making it difficult then also for Islamophobia to be recognized by the state. The government's emphasis has always been on Republican ideals as universal, as if France could also be any other European country. So this denial and this refusal is not accidental, of course. It's strategic, calculated, political, but it is necessary for the logics of whiteness and coloniality continue. And it leads us then to my conclusion, to sort of reflect on how the Muslim-West divide is relevant for understanding Islamophobia. Slide, please. There is an inevitable tension in how governments and politicians continue to focus on the nation, however that is imagined and discursively constructed, as the community to exclude Muslims from. It naturally requires a response that also thinks and critiques in the same terms, and that is most of the work that many of us do. This critique is effective, but the limits of the Muslim Western nation framework are such that Islamophobia often continues to be defined by the present, and so therefore it's always responsive. This thing happened, and now we are responding to it. It leaves out a recognition of recurring patterns and logics of coloniality and whiteness, which make up history and politics, connecting the past and the present. Thinking about Islamophobia in terms of the Muslim-West political divide, as I mentioned very early on in the paper, however, gives us a possibility not only to widen the frame, temporally speaking, but it also creates the possibility for making transnational connections that are not limited to any one country and its particularities of its political context. The challenge, however, in the bigger picture is to create a space for Muslim political agency as a way to resist Islamophobia without flattening out either Islamophobia or Muslims. So I hope that our discussion here today will give us a glimpse of what that might look like. Thank you.
Thank you, Osma, and really it's a great presentation on and making the comparison and highlighting some of the critical points in there. And I think that, Andrea, we have you back. So maybe you could jump into your presentation if you're able to.
Yes. And I'm very sorry that it didn't work with the connection, but I am back.
No need. We all have become experts in, you're muted, you need to get your mic. So that's like the word of the last 2 years. So go ahead, by all means.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for inviting me to this conference. I am really grateful because, well, I have been following the presentations of all participants, and it has been very enriching. And I really hope that I can also make that my participation is also enriching for you, because although I will talk about laicity in France and how this laicity mutated from something positive historically to something negative nowadays. Well, first of all, I really need to situate myself because I am speaking from Mexico. I am Mexican. I am now working in a postdoctoral fellowship in Mexico in a project about laicity and religious diversity in education. So what is the point here is that in my research, I have seen that Mexico, as well as France, has a history with both laicity and secularism. And this is an important fact because both processes in France and in Mexico and in other countries too, some other countries, these processes are seen as being different from each other. And this fact stands in opposition to the Anglo-Saxon field of knowledge production, where the discussion is only about secularism. So I really want to bring this into the discussion. And why? Because in countries where, historically speaking, the Catholic Church has had considerable power, and there has been officially no influence of Protestantism, then laicity is present as a juridical tool which has regulated the separation of state and church. And in Mexico, laicity might be defined nowadays as a juridical tool which, beyond regulating this separation, also regulates the living together of groups of people which have different values. But let's say that laicity is something juridical, it's not a philosophy, whereas secularism is a project, is something else or not. There's also a big debate on secularism, also in Latin America and Mexico, which I can't explain right now. But let's say that this separation is being done in the discussions. So, for example, if I take the definition of Mariana Molina, who is the head of the chair of laicity here at the UNAM in Mexico, Mariana defines secularization as the process concerning the decentralization of religion in the public sphere. Of course, the UNAM is also, as Ramon Grossfogel would say, a westernized university that shares values with France and the Enlightenment. So there is a tendency also in the university to view religion as inferior and atheism and agnosticism as superior. And well, let's say that the fact that religion loses centrality in society is not seen as a problem, but rather a characteristic of modernity or modernization and progress. And well, this is, let's say, not a universal definition or a universal understanding of this process, because, for example, in previous work, and I want to present very, very briefly the previous work of my own, I have also come to a certain understanding of secularization, which differs from the definition of the chair and is related to the topic of today's conference. For example, I have worked previously on secularization as a process, which I would, well, where I relied on women thinkers, Muslim decolonial thinkers like Siri Natli Bisibai, like Horia Boutelja, like Arzu Merali, and looking at the discourses and the thinking of these intellectual women, then we can see that secularization is a process also linked to the Christian missions of colonialism. Secularization is seen as a mission. In the case of Muslim minorities. So, for example, departing from my this is also important, no? The debate on modernity. Departing from my decolonial particular understanding of modernity, of early modern Christian mission, which relied in the conversion to Christianity as the correct religion and the correct God. If we see this as having mutated into a Western mission to expand civilization and the values of enlightenment to the colonial world, then we get another picture as other definitions of secularization might communicate. For example, if, by relying on the work of Dussel and Grossfogel, we can see that we can have a historical view in which the Christian mission secularized and became a mission without religion, without this theological discourse, which was present before, but it doesn't mean that the coloniality changed. So that's why I'm thankful also that the previous speaker talked about coloniality, because this is what remains. And so this mission of secularization has been seen as having fragmented the spaces within Islam, as having imposed a decentralization of religion, which is at the same time the fragmentation of spaces within Islam. So, well, this was just a gap, but I wanted to expose a little bit that, yes, laicity and secularization are seen as different things. One would be a project, secularization. Laicity would be this juridical tool, let's say, that had the aim to make possible a living together of different people in a country. And well, now what I would like to do is to come back to Mexico and to let's say look at laicity in a historical way, and try to see where laicity comes from or stems from, because I think that one of the main reasons in that laicite nowadays in France is such a strong weapon is that it is framed as being a French thing, something exclusive. So if we see that laicite actually, which means the separation of, goes back to the separation of church and state, started in Mexico, according to Jean Bobero and Mexican historiography, in 1861. This means in the 19th century, second half. This happened almost 44 years before the law on laicity appeared in France. This law of laicity appeared in 1905. And so this shows that the concept of laicity might have been theorized in France, but historically the separation of church and state took place outside of France, and it is not exclusive of France, as I was saying. Now, it is important because, as Joria Boutellier has stressed in some of her presentations, last year, laicity as well as fraternity or equality and freedom, she says, in France they are presented as being specifically French, where fraternity exists in other contexts as well as equality and as well as freedom. And here I wanted to say that laicity, maybe the concept developed in France, but not the fact of the separation of church and state. So it comes from somewhere else. I am also not saying that it emerged in Mexico only and it was exported to France. No, but it is important to say when the historical facts of today's discourse do not correspond. Or the facts of today's discourse do not correspond to historical facts, and this is the case of the discourse on exclusivity. Okay, now here, by decentering this exclusivity from Mexico, two facts are important for this aim. And the first one would be that Benito Juárez, who was the Mexican president, who is seen as a hero of the Reformation, and pushed the laws of Reformation for the separation of church and state. He had important links, this is important to mention, to the US, as well as ties to automatically to Protestantism and evangelicalism. So, so let's say that this thing, which is framed as very French, as being French, laicity, it did not only come in a way from Mexico, but the influence came from somewhere else, came maybe from the Protestant world. So this is important to really delink laicite from France. For example, and nowadays, anthropologist Carlos Garba Navarro, who is an expert on Protestant groups in contemporary Mexico, he has shown that Protestant groups in Mexico make a strong link to Benito Juárez while contextualizing historically their identity as Mexican Christian Protestants. So the link of Benito Juárez to the Anglo-Saxon world is also important to stress. Okay, this is one point. And the second point I wanted to make is that if we follow the work of historians of the early 19th century in Mexico, this is in the time of the Reformation laws or before, we can see that this argument of separations, or that institutions separated themselves from the church and state, has a much longer history. I mean, which means that it did not begin with this laws of Reformation and the time where they're implemented. So it began before. For example, historian Andrea Torres Alejo, who is a colleague of mine and researches a particular school in Mexico, in Mexico City, which is a Basque Jesuit school. She's researching that this school lived the process of separation and emancipation from the church and from Spanish authority and from the state, much before the laws of Reformation. And this is an important example because when the Reformation came in Mexico and closed every Catholic school that existed, this school wasn't closed because it declared itself as laic. It was already laic when the Reformation came. So, or these laws of Reformation came. So I give these two facts because I think they're important to the link, again, this laïcité from French exclusive authorship. Again, I repeat, this authorship, this exclusiveness is what gives power to this discourse on laicity as being something Republican, something French, and as framing it as something that if certain communities don't respect, then they are against exactly this core of French republicanism. Okay, and comparing to the context in 1905, where laicity in France ensured the living together of different groups of people by warranting equality before the law, and then defending this freedom of conscience, which included religious freedom. I'm going to talk about it right now. That in 1905, this like imposed atheism that today exists did not exist. It was a law for the living together of different groups with different religion, and so this had a very bad turn. This concept, it migrated of being a concept for peace to being a weapon against Islam. So and yes, it's now framed, is now used to impose neutrality and atheism, and as the correct way to live in France, and to frame Islam as anti-republican and anti-French. Well, actually, I want to just present some points that were made by two guests that we had in a symposium here in Mexico last year. Last year, there was a symposium on laicity, and we had the honor to have Jean Bobero as guest, and also Joria Botella in one of these events on laicity, where we in Mexico wanted also to see what is happening with this thing of laicity. And I think both presenters, both intellectuals, really gave very important points to understand what is laicity in France and how it became this weapon against Islam, which has a very different history than the history of laicity in Mexico. I mean, there are two different things. And this is also important for us in Mexico because, yes, there is a tendency to think that Mexican laicity is like French laicity, so we should behave like that. And this is a form of also of colonial domination, to live with this concept. So for us, it was important to see what is Mexican laicity in Mexico and what happened in France, which is where laicity became fundamentalist. Okay, so first I would like to present some points made by Jean Bobero. And the first one, I was talking about it at the beginning of my presentation, that he presented the first definition of laicity as being made by Ferdinand Buisson in 1883. And Bobero says that in this definition, the objectives of the laic state would be to first to ensure the quality of all citizens before the law, and to let's say promote individual freedom of conscience as a public right, and second, to guarantee the freedom of all cults, taking into account the plurality of all religious spaces, and this meaning the freedom of conscience from collective public freedom. So in this sense, he said that the state was understood as a kind of referee between different religions and convictions to avoid discrimination. So as we see, the laicity which was proposed, even in France in 1883, was not a weapon against one religion. It conceived the state as being the regulator between different groups. And well, as of course, there is also always a question: what happens with this referee, the state as referee? What happens to this concept of neutrality? Also, according to Bobéron, going into this point of neutrality, it's important to say that he described it as being founded on top of a paradox. So he said that on the one side, laicity desires liberty of conscience for all convictions, supposing that no one religion or philosophy can impose its truth regime. But on the other hand, historically, laicity emerged from within a particular political philosophy, which is liberal political philosophy, which implies a liberal conception of religion, but also at the same time, Bobéron argues, this conception must not be imposed on society or deprive the individual of his or her own freedom or choice. So I think here he's giving us a very important material also to see that there is a tension, a theoretical tension between laicity and the religious doctrines, and that the paradox relies in that one particular political philosophy is at the foundation of the freedom of different religions and convictions. And this is very important to stress the particularity and not the universality of a philosophy. He says it is particular and it is wanting to guarantee the freedom of everyone. So there is a paradox. So he says, and what happens with this paradox? What Bobéron is also warning is that if it is done carefully, this the state as mediator, or this paradox, or this pretended neutrality, could manage, let's say, the conflict in a positive way, only if it do not becomes a doctrine, which is what I would argue that is happening today.
Just there are about 3 minutes, so.
Okay. I'm sorry. Okay, so okay, now, then I'm gonna close very. I'm gonna make a resume of my arguments. Well, this point is very important because what has happened is that the laicite has become doctrinary, and it is hindering the freedom of conscience instead of giving the possibility of this freedom of conscience. And why? Because laicity returned to itself and became the source of the sacralization of state. So I find this argument very important. And then, well, Bobéron, I am going to list, I'm going to say what, just a list of things that he argued that have been argued by other authors. And for example, the thing that laicity is sold as being the defender of the equality of men and women, he said this is not true. The same has been said by John Wallack Scott. This is not true. Laicity was used so that women could not vote at the time. So this is not true. And well, now I would like to close by going straight to Horia Bouteldia, because in her conference here in Mexico, she made a very important point in which after she described the context of Islamophobia in France, how did it emerge, how did it go from bad to worse, everything that happened with the associations, everything that happened with the witch hunt with against anyone who wasn't following the doxa of the state. She describes the point of today's laicity as a way to separating or fragmenting the workers' movement. So what Huria described is that there was worker movements and protests all around France. And these protests were composed of people, of white and non-white people, white people and racialized people. And so the state used the argument of laicity actually to divide the protests and manifestations and make this white, non-white divide, superior, inferior, with the laicity, and so articulating also this superior, inferior, let's say, representation with the moderate, atheist, and religious divide. So Huria describes this as a very, let's say, important way of weaponizing laicity with and divide and fragment the social movements in France. So I would like to stop here just to say that how laicity turned in time from a concept to a weapon.
Well, thank you, Andrea. So the weaponization of laicite in the French context and the weaponization of Islamophobia as a tool, political tool, is something that we're all are studying and attempting to understand. So it's great to have you from Mexico, and hopefully we'll be able to visit at one point and have further conversations and conferences in Mexico as well. So muchas gracias. We have one of our audience members are saying. So I want to move to our next presenter, Philip Ode, or Odi, depending on if I'm pronouncing it correctly, and try to bring you up to the conversation. He's currently doing his PhD at York University in Humanities, and is also a student in the Graduate Diploma of International and Security Studies program. His interests intersects war on terror, racial and ethnic identities, including Muslim identity, white supremacy, but also critically, Philip is working with our dear colleague, Jasmine Zion, on the Canadian Islamophobia report. So we have, many ways that our work intersects. So please, Philip, the stage is yours.
Excellent, thank you. All right. Is it possible to have my presentation put up, please?
Sure. So Omar in the back side.
Excellent, thank you. All right, so first of all, a special thank you goes out to the Islamophobia Studies Center for hosting this imperative conference and for having me alongside our esteemed presenters that we've had today and have yet to have present. I'd like to first welcome again to my presentation on defining the non-religious in Quebec's Bill 21. Next slide, please. Well, doesn't look like it's coming up. That's okay. Within the humanities, what does it mean for a nation, state, or a governmental entity to be considered secular? As quoted by Douglas Farrow, a truly secular society that dares to live without the idols of patriotism, civil religion, or creeds of any kind. For my presentation in particular, I'll be examining Quebec's Bill 21. It doesn't look like the words are coming up. We can just probably close that presentation if you don't mind. You can barely see the words there. I apologize on that. Okay, so continuing on. So Bill 21 is classified as an act respecting the laicite of the state, and it passed in early 2019 to reinforce the province's stance on secularization. Sequentially, albeit after numerous debates in the public sphere, the crucifix that hung in the National Assembly was taken down, as quoted in the Montreal Gazette, to reaffirm the secular character of our institution. The debates surrounding the separation of church and state have been a contentious issue for arguably most of modern history. The Quebec chapter is all but another page in this discourse. With advances towards the modern view of secularization in the Western world, as can be seen through France, Belgium, and of course Quebec, the debate continuously turns to what is to be considered religious and non-religious. The implications of this definition continue to be at the forefront of legislative pieces such as Bill 21. So in my paper, I examine what is religious and non-religious, including the secular, in the context of contemporary Quebec and the consequences that impact minority religious groups in the province, specifically the Muslim population. Bill 21 uses functions of colonial government power to control and limit, while also privileging certain what are deemed by the state as religions over what are considered non-religious groups within Quebec. These techniques have been witnessed in history before, as Jolion Baraka Thomas argues in his text. Colonial constructions of secularism can deeply impact minority religious groups, similar to the case during the post-Second World War period in American-occupied Japan. By using Thomas's framework, I will demonstrate that the very traits the American government used in occupied Japan to constrict religious minorities while privileging Christianity is very much similar to that of Bill 21's attempt to secularize the province of Quebec by restricting religious minorities in terms of religiously classified outward appearance. Within Thomas's detailed book, Faking Liberties, Religious Freedom in American-occupied Japan, he explores the constructed definitions of the religious, non-religious, secular, and religious freedom within the Japanese pre- and post-Second World War context. When addressing these definitions surrounding religion and consequently non-religion, he grapples with a variety of scholarly descriptions of state Shinto, whereby it was argued that Japan had failed to secularize itself as a nation, and that Shintoism was viewed to be the national religion of the country. When America occupied Japan after World War II, the definition of the secular was based out of their own colonial-centric definition, throwing into question the legitimacy of religious freedom in Japan during the pre-occupation period. This is further debated with the mandated Shinto shrine visitations being classified by the Japanese as an act of patriotism rather than being something religious in nature, as viewed by the American occupiers. In the period of the American occupation, President Roosevelt declared that his 4 freedoms would be guaranteed for Japan, specifically the challenge presented of religious freedom and freedom of religion. However, as Thomas argues, the Meiji Constitution had already guaranteed religious freedom, and the colonial perception of state Shinto first needed to be created for it to be destroyed, thus justifying the American occupation and Western-framed secular ambitions for Japan. What was defined as religious by the state could be used in ways to classify some groups as real religions, thus being worthy of protection by and from the state, while others classified as cults or false religions would be subjected to limitations or all-out exclusion. Thus, the impact of classifying religions such as Christianity as real religions and the colonial-based construction of the term led to the state elevating Christianity over religions predominantly in Japan, including Shintoism and Buddhism. Additionally, any sign or symbol can be given the meaning of religious or political, further complicating the debate between secular and religious. What constitutes a religion in general comes down to the power dynamics that are present within the context, specifically with the only true religion being Christianity in the American-occupied Japan era. The issues arising with the definition of the secular contributes to constructing a hierarchy of religions. This can be seen in contemporary Quebec, where debates surrounding legislature being passed in the province's National Assembly rarely affect those under the Christian faith, while greatly impacting those classified as religious minorities within the province. This guise of religious freedom and the separation of church and state has been used in legislative pieces in Quebec's history to target minorities within the province, specifically Bill 21, in attempts to protect the laicite, or separation of religion and the state. This is quite clear when the National Assembly of Quebec argued that the crucifix, an obvious Christian religious symbol hanging in the National Assembly, be left on display in the very place in which bills such as Bill 21 are being passed to ensure the secularization of Quebec. Up until its removal in July of 2019, Quebec could not claim to be secular in the popular sense of the term, as it was continually offering sanctuary for the sacred in its own house through minority religious groups were being forced to choose between the religion and provincial law. Quebec defines itself as not a province like the others, regarding themselves as their own nation while considering Canada as a binational political entity. In doing so, Quebec continues to strive to be a mimic nation of its former creator and ruler, France. Following France's lead, Quebec wanted to concern itself with not only to guarantee individual freedom of religion, but also to guarantee individual freedom from religion. When it comes to guaranteeing the citizens of Quebec these freedoms, the pillars of Quebec's public culture, including the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, the Charter of French Language, also known as Bill 101, and the very selective immigration policy, or the religious neutrality of the state, already contain the safeguards to ensure that basic principles such as gender equality, fairness, or the religious neutrality of the state were legally protected and allowed the democratic majority to pursue reasonable collective progress. These reasonable safeguards to protect the popular majority in Quebec, specifically looking at Bill 101, was a signal to Canada and the rest of the world that if immigrants or newcomers were looking to thrive in Quebec, participation in Quebec society needed to be based on and out of the French language. Protecting the French-Canadian minority within Canada has overtaken the front lines of Quebec legislature. Bills such as Bill 101 and more recently Bill 21 refuse to acknowledge the religious and cultural diversity that is apparent throughout Canada, not just within Quebec's own borders. The pure wool frame rampant within Quebec, as Sharifi, Funk, and Guzik argue, frames diverse religious influences within Quebec society, including Indigenous spirituality, atheism, Catholicism, Islam, and various other traditions as inauthentic. Feelings of inauthenticity or not belonging to the majority within Quebec additionally creates increased barriers to participation in public life. The legally framed bans reinforced in Bill 21 on overtly religious symbols add to this discourse. Sharifi, Funk, and Guzik conclude that such bans on religious symbols in the public sphere play into the argument that religious values and expressions should be limited to that of domestic or the private sphere. The Stasi Commission in France could very well be a significant precursor to Bill 21 in Quebec. One of the major recommendations in the Commission advocated for the banning of ostentatious religious signs in public schools, effectively shutting out any overt expression of one's religious adherence in the public education system in France. Citizens wishing to access the public education system must not display or any devotion to one's religion. Similarly, in Bill 21, the Act proposes to prohibit certain persons from wearing religious symbols while exercising their functions of public service. Persons who are present themselves to receive a service from such a personnel member of the state must have their face uncovered when doing so, and it is necessary to allow their identity to be verified or for security reasons. Persons who fail to comply with that obligation may not receive the service. If the freedom of religion is supposed to be a balance between the absence of coercion and respect for diversity of opinions, then why are Muslims subjugated to such laws? The certain persons being referred to are overwhelmingly the Muslim minority within Quebec, as was similar with Bills 94 and 60, which emphasized Islamic religious symbols, in particular Muslim women veils, over symbols and clothing from other traditions. Elements of cultural anxiety, the overblown threats of Islamic or Islamist terrorism, and the increase of the securitization of the West have all contributed to the targeting of the Muslim minority within Quebec and elsewhere in the West. Political entities such as the Parti Québécois channeled these contemporary issues in attempts to defend Quebec's heritage and secularism from the perceived encroaching religious fanatics. Furthermore, the limiting nature of such bills as Bill 21 actively contribute to the ongoing narrative of Islamophobia in the West. As explained by Jasmine Zine in Islam in the Hinterlands, the narratives of citizenship, nationalism, and security have been inextricably linked to the public discourse and policymaking in ways that disproportionately target Canadian Muslims as potential threats to public safety and comprise their civil liberties. More so in the post 9/11 era, it is easy to witness that there have been significant rises in policies and legislature that actively target the Muslim minority globally and within the context of Quebec, ultimately based on the grounds of national security and protection from the religion of Islam. This innate fear and fascination with the Orient, and consequentially with cultures and religions that have origins in the region, has been discussed at length by scholars such as Said, concluding that there are Westerners and there are Orientals. The former dominate and the latter must be dominated. In the context of Quebec's legislature in Bill 21, it is apparent that the province is attempting to push back against the false belief of Islamic encroachment on French Canadian secular values. The fear of the other, being seen as the West's contrasting image, idea, personality, and experience, has become entrenched within these policies, seeking to actively disrupt collaborative measures of minority religions, such as Islam, to coexist in a secular Quebec. Quebec's Bill 21 asserts legislative privilege and dominance over a religion that is being incorrectly classified in the post 9/11 era as a danger to secular Western values. The Muslim practice of veiling contributes to a growing atmosphere of Islamophobia, in which visible symbols of Islamic identity induce public anxiety, whether based on the grounds of security or religious values. To combat these fears and anxieties, bills such as Bill 21 have been passed to further draw distinguishing lines of what is acceptable in secular Quebec society and what religions should be excluded from the public domain to receive these essential services. In the minds of those that adhere to their religious duties and beliefs, their religion is above and unaffected by law, once again leaving the person being put between two all-encompassing commitments. Legislature and policies, including Bill 21, seek to create divides among religious and cultural minority groups within Quebec and the state. In the cases of obeying such policies, religious minorities, including Muslims, are faced with significant spiritual and ethical dilemmas, whether to remove signs of devotion or one's covenant with the religion in order to receive a public service or not. The accountability is thus placed on the religious and/or spiritual individual to conform to such practices and policies to integrate and assimilate, rather forcefully, into Quebec society or be isolated from the public sphere and services. While laïcité is widely understood to preserve France's, and in the case of Bill 21, Quebec's, public education, healthcare, and judicial systems from intervention by religious groups, it is also expected to demonstrate respect for all faiths and spiritual choices. Bills such as Bill 21 are now taking the Islamophobic narratives that are constantly being experienced by the Muslim minority in Canada and placing this Islamophobia directly into legislative practices. In addition to surrounding issues revolving around sexism in the contemporary world, Muslim women who choose to show their devotion to their religion via religious dress are often subjugated to, as Zine rightfully argues, a specific discourse of foreignness and otherness, and came to see their identities as Muslims being socially evaluated and ultimately rejected. In the name of secularism and laïcité politics in Quebec, the Muslim minority is in effect being pushed further into the breaks of isolation, otherness, and ultimately alienation from the very society in which they live. Quebec's once unthinkable Bill 21 is now part of Quebec law, passing with a 73-35 vote on June 16th, 2019. And yet the question still remains, is freedom of religion an inherent aspect of secularism, or does secularism serve to relegate religion to the home? And thank you. That's the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Philip, on your presentation. It was great. And I'm going to shift right now immediately to Sana Shah and Ashwarya Bhata Sharaya. Am I pronouncing that correctly with the names? So I'm going to pull up Sana, and they're joining us all the way from India right now, as far as the time. So this would be, what time is it at your end?
4:30.
4:30 a.m. Bless you. That's such a time to be ready for us. It's really, we're honored for you to be with us.
Very happy to.
Sana is a research scholar in political theory She has studied at the University of Kashmir, and now she is a researcher, a scholar in political theory, and doing Master of Philosophy in Political Science at Johar Nehru University in Delhi, as well as Ashwarya as well. She's a policy researcher and Master of Philosophy as well in the political science and government. So it's a pleasure for us to have both of you. So welcome and take us for this presentation. I just inform people that we have Professor Salman Sayed, who's going to conclude the conference after your presentations. So go ahead. Welcome. You need to unmute, make sure that...
Yeah. Is it audible?
Yes, we could hear you.
All right. Thank you so much.
Right,
thank you. Before beginning, we would like to thank the Islamophobia Studies Center for giving us this opportunity and for having us here. We're equally honored. So as the title of the paper goes, it is Seeing Like the Minorities, Moral Injury, Affirmative Action, and Theoretical Aporia in the Framework of Secular Governance. So as it is evident from the title that we are going to present a critique of the framework of secular governance through the question of moral injury as well as affirmative action. Before, however, beginning, I would first want to lay out the scheme of the presentation. To begin with, I would quickly list the main arguments of the paper. Then we will frame the critique of the framework of secular governance by first talking about the subject of moral injury. And I will do this by flagging two examples, one from France and one from India, because we have a first experience here. And after establishing how secular governance fails to translate the notion of moral injury, which in turn fans the flames of religious prejudice and separatism, Aishwarya will table the findings on minority empowerment thesis to show how the resort to affirmative action for minority empowerment within the framework of secular governance, instead of empowering minorities, works to the detriment of the minorities and sows the seeds of religious separatism. So the main arguments basically are as follows. This paper takes the question of moral injury on one hand and affirmative action for minority empowerment on the other hand for study in order to map the limitations in the framework of secular governance. The limitations so mapped in turn accentuate the theoretical aporia in the framework of secular governance, which has also fueled Islamophobia. Instead of perceiving Islamophobia as a standalone or independent category for study, the submission is that it must be read as an effect of the failings or the limitations of secular governance, to which France is no exception, and to which India is no exception as well. And this is so because of its inability to translate certain aspects that assume a weight of a different kind in relation to the matters of religion. The secular framework of governance, however, in order to read, legislate, and make legible the religious subjects, presumes and subsequently ends up reinforcing a particular kind of religious competition. And owing to this theoretical aporia, it proffers nations with the scope to engineer divisions, prejudice, and separatism. Now, the events or the incidents that I would really want you to consider as, and we use as examples for this study, are basically two, as I already mentioned. One from France, which in particular is basically the string of events, the after events in the wake of republishing of the cartoons of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, in early September 2020, which was just 2 years ago, by the French magazine Charlie Hebdo. And the after events which occurred, including some killings, some comments, protests, counter-protests. And the second example, because India is the largest democracy, and as I said, India is no exception to Islamophobia, and it has been growing manifold in the recent times. So the second example, therefore, would be the Supreme Court verdict which is delivered basically on Barbary Mosque demolition case, which was followed, and this is important, in August 2020, this was followed by a foundation laying ceremony, or what we call as the Bhumi Pujan, to lay the foundation stone for the Ram temple, which was to be built in the place of Barbary Mosque after the mosque was demolished. And it was essentially a religious ceremony, a ceremony that was held amidst a raging pandemic, and it was attended, and this is important, attended by the Prime Minister of India and kind of presided over. I would definitely be drawing on Sabah Mahmood's framework on moral injury. And to begin with the first example then, I want actually to think in the direction that while the Hebdo controversy, the Charlie Hebdo controversy, dates back many years in time, however, the steam has not yet settled, and it only seems to worsen further, which brings into the conceptual crucible the idea of French laïcité and the recent debates in the view of the controversy. To begin with, therefore, it is pertinent to accentuate what the popular terms of the debates were then, within which the killings in the aftermath of the Charlie Hebdo publishing were seen, and what are the major tropes to understand basically the issue. A major trope was freedom, free speech, freedom of expression, freedom of press, freedom to debate, and the right to offend, the right to criticize, the right to mock as a part of the national cultural ethos of the French Republic. A recent link in the string came under fire when tens of thousands of protesters across South Asia vented their fury at France in 2020, with a crowd in Bangladesh burning an effigy of the president of France, Emmanuel Macron, as anger flared over his tough stance on Islamic extremism, so to say. Macron defended the Charlie Hebdo magazine, saying in early September, and that was just before he was to introduce laws on separatism, that the right to free speech included the right to blaspheme, and pledged to fight against what he described as Islamic separatism in France. Macron later said that Islam was in crisis all over the world and announced a drive to separate religion from education and public sector in the country. He said, and I quote, "The problem is an ideology," he's referring to Islam here, "which claims its own laws should be superior to those of the Republic." Now, it is equally important to mention that at the same time, the government of India had strongly backed the stance of the French government. These comments were made when the French president announces long-awaited law against separatism, which was aimed at combating radical Islam in France. Now, at the same time, some counter comments were recorded, and the influential university mosque Al-Azhar Cairo in Cairo described this statement as racist. And that is one way of looking at the entire debate. Thereafter, the forthcoming judgments assumed that what is at stake is a moral impasse between what the Muslim minority community considers as an act of blasphemy as a terms of debate on one hand, and what the non-Muslim majority regards as an exercise of freedom of expression, so essential to the self-understanding of the French Republic through this kind of secular liberal vocabulary, as if there is a monolithic conception inbred in French laïcité, a kind of vocabulary that reads the moral impasse, but is not able to translate this moral injury. The entire debate, this was conceptualized between what Sabah Mahmood would call secular necessity and religious threat. And in this formulation, the choice is clear. Either one is against the secular values or for them. Now, this kind of resort immediately reduces the matter of the debate to the language of identity politics, religious fanaticism, and cultural or civilizational difference. And these themes were recurrent in 2020 after the cartoons were republished, evoking a similar counter-protest on the ground and on social media this time as well. Now, what is of importance here is that during the counter-protest, the recurrent phrase to express the anger at the stance of French government employed certain terms. Now, those terms were respect, honor, and pride, to embody the reverence for the Prophet. In a similar manner, many people changed the display pictures and their profile pictures to posters that read, "My Prophet, my honor, my Prophet, my pride," indicating that what had happened was considered by many Muslims as a personal insult, a loss, a hurt, an injury, a subject of grief, attack on their honor as unbearable, given the sense of relationality that a set of Muslims subscribe to with the Prophet in general. Now, this kind of injury requires moral action, but its language is neither juridical nor that of street protest because it does not belong to an economy of blame, accountability, and reparations. The action it requires is internal to the structure of effect, relations, and virtues that predisposes one to experience an act as a violation in the first place, something which the secular governance framework has a tough time to make sense of. Now, coming to the second example, which is of the Barbary Mosque demolition and the foundation laying ceremony of the temple, of the Ram temple, and the solemn attendance of the Prime Minister. Now, in August 2020, after the Supreme Court of India delivered its verdict on the Barbary Masjid demolition case, a foundation laying ceremony was organized to lay the foundation stone for the Ram temple. This was essentially, as I said already, a religious ceremony. The ceremony held amidst a raging pandemic, attended by Prime Minister of India and other dignitaries, organized coincidentally on the exact date that marked 1 year into the abrogation of Article 370 in Kashmir, through which the semi-autonomous status of the region was revoked. Now, the Ram temple dispute at Ayodhya harks back to the contention, and I'm trying to contextualize it here. It harks back to the contention wherein a mosque dating back to the Mughal era stood. It was argued that the mosque stood at the place of Lord Ram's, a Hindu god, Lord Ram's birthplace, and therefore the mosque should be demolished in order to create space for the building of a temple to mark Lord Ram's birthplace. In a very responded series of events and episodes, one leading into the another, in 1992, a mob campaigned for the demolition of the mosque and razed it to the ground. The mob climbed atop the mosque, and thereafter it was razed to the ground. Thereafter, after a long battle in courts, wherein legal lens was resorted to and employed, constitutional secular language was invoked, the court, pandering to the majority sentiment, permitted the building of the temple without really attesting to any evidence or archaeological source as an evidence to prove that the birthplace actually existed. And the mobs involved in the Barbaric Act walked scot-free. No arrest was really made. Now, to celebrate the foundation laying of this very temple, the Prime Minister of a constitutional secular nation presided over the event. Now, two things should be noted here. First, that presiding over a religious ceremony in a secular nation is not in itself a problematic act. This has been a frequent practice of India, and prime ministers and presidents have attended such kind of temple-laying foundation ceremonies, while a number of prime ministers have had their own reservations. However, India has been boasting of a secular fabric that accords equal respect to all religions and maintains principled distance from all religions. Therefore, many presidents have, and many prime ministers have, obviously presided over similar ceremonies. Secondly, in a response to the criticism of this solemn attendance of Prime Minister, however, for this very temple-laying ceremony, because to have this temple built and the mosque demolished, there was bloodshed, there was violence, people were murdered, there were riots in parts of the country, and thereafter Prime Minister decided to attend this ceremony. And to rebut this criticism, it was stated that the Prime Minister is a citizen of a secular country, and going by the fundamental right to freedom of religion, he can, in that capacity, attend functions related to his faith and belief. Though if one is to go by the words in the formal invitation cards, these refer to Prime Minister Modi's official designation, and unless he makes an unequivocal declaration that he is attending the event in his individual capacity, his visits will be treated as an official one. The dimension of moral injury, therefore, will help us puncture this response that is bordered by the citizen exercising freedom of religion clause. This understanding of a citizen exercising freedom of religion clause is largely liberal understanding of rights and freedom, which was resorted by a right-oriented government to paint the act in secular terms. And this is clearly seen by many scholars as the dwindling of secular governance, if not its outright collapse. Albeit, our argument is that secularism had enabled the same in the first place and was far from a collapse of this framework. This was a movement that clearly could not be challenged through law and through juridical language of the secular governance, because going by the constitutional injunctions, this solemn attendance was completely compatible, and there was no secular provision that could be employed by the liberal sensibilities to make sense of this moral injury or to gauge the degree of this intangible hurt inflicted on the religious minorities living in the country. At the same time, while at a formal level, this minority in India has been reckoned as an equal citizen in law, and this configuration by secular governance neglects the power inequalities that have produced the very category of this minority through privileging of majoritarian norms, of which the affair of the temple laying, the foundation laying ceremony, and the entire movement which led to the mosques demolition and the Supreme Court verdict were yet another example of. And it is important here to also shed some light on the secular trajectory of Indian state. India as a post-colonial nation took birth in the aftermath of a partition that was engineered through communal sentiments, resulting into mass killings, rapes, incidents of torture and brutality. However, since then, the Indian state has been flaunting its secular credentials in the face of resistance from certain sections. Now, in doing so, what has actually happened is that a job of this violent engineering on the lines of religion has been outsourced to the section of the population or public which is subscribed to this exclusionary ideology that the nation belongs to a particular religious majority. Those radical forces have proven adept at being able to advance their ideological agendas in and through the values of secular governance, equality, and tolerance, largely the central premise of over which liberal theory stands. So therefore, when the Ram Temple court dispute caught currency for various reasons, it was not a standalone event, and it should not be seen as one, but the logical culmination of a deep-seated hatred and prejudice towards Muslims that was seen as aliens. On the other hand, whatever the case, the Muslims for ages have resorted to the constitutional vocabulary to affirm their belongingness to the nation, reiterating the constitutional guarantees as citizens of the largest democracy in the world. And on similar lines, so did the second-generation immigrants who grew up as French Muslims in France. So while they were constantly asked to prove their nationalism and dutifulness to the nation each time, the Muslims obliged relying on the liberal secular oaths and pronouncements to respond to these kind of attacks. This, however, remains clouded from view by political secularism's claim to neutrality and minority empowerment and equality in India or in France. This observation, however, now will become clearer in subsequent sections, where the fallouts of secular governance will become clearer and more pronounced as it tries to extend itself through minority empowerment thesis in order to mitigate the issue of religious discrimination. It in effect is unable to account for the majoritarian perception regarding a religious minority here Muslims. And my co-author Aishwarya will further expand on this idea through her findings. Aishwarya.
We have 5 more minutes left, so just to make sure that.
That's okay. Sorry, I missed it. 4 minutes? 5 minutes?
5 minutes.
5 minutes. Okay. Thank you so much. Thank you for your patience. And okay, so quickly, this paper developed into independent parts. We looked at the French case and the literature review that Sana presented. That aside, when we talk about the Indian case, we've picked Bengal, West Bengal, as the case study. 2 reasons. First being this the eastern part of India has a history of liberation movements based on linguistic nationality and not so much in terms of religious nationality. So the expectation that there is already a secular fabric who would get together and fight for a language instead of fighting amongst themselves for religion was already existing. The other reason being that West Bengal saw good 35, 34 years of left government ruling. So also pedagogically, there is another added expectation that there is a certain development that is beyond religion or religion-based identities. Now, why this is the field for this particular study is because I'm going to use the abbreviation TMC for Trinamool Congress, which is really a regional party which is in power in West Bengal. We have a quasi-federal state, arguably. So the center has BJP, the Bharatiya Janata Party. I'm going to go with BJP to remove too many difficult words. And the TMC at the state level, which you would say province, almost similar, not same. The TMC came to power in 2011. Now let's quickly see who voted for the TMC. Everyone. I mean, a good half the population, a little bit more, and that's the majority. So when I'm saying half the population for a state which has 70.5% Hindu residents, voters, then I mean more than Muslim votes, which is not even 1/3 of the state's total population. When TMC wins the 2011 elections, they set out, they're already getting the larger chunk of the minority votes. And this is available data, so it's not really my research, just to form the base. And then they win again in 2016, similar results. They are still winning huge number of seats, minority votes, as well as, again, if they're winning with the majority, they definitely have Hindu votes. They have a large majority, so it would mean more than half of the 70.5% of Hindu population. Again, 2021 elections, and TMC again wins with a huge majority. Now, the interesting sideline to the story is that every passing election, so the state or the provincial elections for 2016, the 2019 General Assembly elections for the central government in India, and the 2021 State Legislative Assembly elections again, sees a rise in the number of votes that the BJP, which is arguably a far-right Hindutva promoting party, their vote share grows in the state. They do not win, but there's a sizable change in the vote share. If we go by the argument that there has been a shift in the way Hindus have always seen the Trinamool Congress or the TMC as a party that has supported minorities. There is a term which is very fancy these days, appeased the minorities. Or if we have a blanket understanding saying that the TMC has won over minority votes but lost support of the Hindu majority, that cannot be supported by data, because they're still winning elections and they're doing fairly well. What has happened is that a smaller chunk of the Hindu population and across the subgroups within the Hindus have started voting for the BJP. Let's simply call them the Hindu far right within the state. There are a lot of regional journalistic works on this. There are very few academic findings yet. So the aim of our research was to see that why would the BJP or this Hindu far right body gain support in the state, who are still by and far, by good margins, still supporting TMC, and TMC is still winning. So the increase in the vote share of the BJP, that had to be looked into. We used a lot of ethnometric approaches mostly, but we've also done a little survey, which is not more than 380 respondents, because we went with the minimum possible number. lack of resources and the pandemic, and I'm really sorry about that. We have a margin error of around 7%, but that aside, we have most responses that come across to say that the minority has gotten the better half of the secular governance. And when I'm saying secular governance, it's not so much a term that we are using, but the term that people themselves say, that these secular public policies are only helping the minorities, and we're not really getting anything out of this. We also understand it's wrong to discriminate in terms of religion, but here's what it is. This understanding, which is not an explicit observation, but very ethno-Methodist, it's coming out of regular conversations, going by the book definition of ethno-methodology for that matter, is not something that would explicitly create large-scale riots or large-scale visible Islamophobia. No posters out there, no Twitter campaigns, but its existence and its gradual unfolding through the electoral results, through the smaller discursive practices in terms of when a Muslim festival is to be celebrated, when Milad would happen, or when a Hindu festival would be celebrated. Could you take the procession out on the same streets or not? In these regular daily practices, this is quite visible. So even though our research was pretty exploratory for that matter, because we could not come up with a solution saying that, hey, this is our question. Is everyone happy with a government that has very firm affirmative action policies that is hell-bent and thankfully towards skim-based working class, which is mostly the Muslim in our state, in West Bengal. They are poorer in terms of material benefits. They are poor in terms of land ownership. They have seen, Bengal has gone through 3 different partitions, 1970s, 1940s, 1900s. So for every other advantage and disadvantages, we find the Muslim minority at the disadvantageous end. Yet, the idea is that affirmative policies in the state is not for the welfare of everyone in the state, but welfare of a few. However, not all the policies are specifically to, I'll just take 30 seconds more. Thank you. Are not specifically to support, or does not come up and say that we are here to only support minority, the Muslim minority population at all. So this undercurrent is what my colleague and I would like to call the disadvantage of secular governance that does not come with a coupled pedagogical change in the social fiber itself. Thank you. I have a lot of people to thank. There's the York Center for Asian Research, there's the Bartlett Development Planning Unit, University College London, and the Waqf Board in West Bengal for all the help and the professional personal growth. Thank you so much, Professor, for bearing with us. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you for coming and presenting. It's definitely... the research is not disconnected from the broader discourse. The discussions about affirmative action is still with us here in the United States, and how it gets to be framed. There's also discussions in South Africa in terms of how to move and to address the disadvantages structurally embedded in the modern state relative to minorities. So now we have another element to compare relative to India. So thank you for your presentations, and I'm going to move to try to bring Salman Sayed at this point from Leeds University, who is a co-partner with all of the work that we do. So I'm going to take you out from the stream to the studio at this point, and then bring up Salman Sayed. It's good to have you. is joining us from Leeds, or is it from London directly? So you need to unmute yourself. That's the
rule. Yeah, it's from the metropolis, London itself.
It's from London, so it's really good to have you. It's around 11:40 p.m. your time. So go ahead. I'll give you the stage.
Well, thank you very much, Hatham, and thank you for everyone. I'm very, very pleased to be speaking at the 8th Paris Conference on Islamophobia. I want to ask one very simple question, I think, and then make some remarks on that. I've listened to many of the papers here, but not as much as I would have liked. And I've been struck by one thing, which I want to really talk about, is why did Islamophobia become global? If you reflect on the emergence of the category of Islamophobia, specifically, which predates 9/11 by a decade or so, at least, in its modern iterations, then it is something which is focused upon the nation state. It's focused upon minorities in Britain and in France, etc. Islamophobia is something which happens in a few countries and not others. So the question then becomes is how do we explain Islamophobia and what are the vectors for it? Now, a very quick answer would be, and this is an answer that you often get when you present on these talks, someone will turn around and say, well, Islamophobia is really, really bad, but ultimately we have to do something about it because who causes Islamophobia are actions of Muslims, and it depends on how generous someone is, whether it's as a Muslim minority or a Muslim majority, or the number of the Muslims who are responsible for Islamophobia by their extremism, their violence, etc. That becomes the causal relationship on that. And of course, the war on terror then becomes a mechanism for this. Now, what is interesting is if you look at the various manifestations of Islamophobia, let's say, for example, in India or in China or in France or in Burma, they often now use the vocabulary of the war on terror, and they're not really being against Muslims, they're against extremism. Chinese administrators are very, very quick and keen to use almost identical phraseology as for countering violent extremism as coined by governments in the West. So you have an odd situation where you have governments of what would describe themselves as established liberal democracies like France, Austria, the United States. You have governments which would consider themselves to be the largest democracies in the world, or governments which would consider themselves to be certainly People's Republic or socialist or communist, etc. So very, very different forms of government in very, very different cultural settings, all expressing themselves through Islamophobia. And clearly there are many, many local reasons. But what I want to do is just make three observations, really. And I want to start off by saying, okay, let's accept that Islamophobia is a type of racism. And that's a quick and easy way of trying to understand what the phenomenon is. And let's also accept that racism is not caused by the existence of races, but rather racism leads to the formation of populations into races. In other words, it's racism that causes races rather than the other way around. And then that leads us to the point that to understand racism as not as a set of prejudices or attitudes, but really as a form of governance, a form of regulation, a form of disciplining. in which the racialized subject is shaped by structures, institutions, into particular ways. For their behavior is coerced into or compelled into acting in such a way. So if we take that for granted, then the task of explaining Islamophobia often replays the historiography of explanations used to explain racism. And I want to just fix on one main one in which racism was explained in instrumental terms. And you can see the analog of that how racism is now explained, Islamophobia is now explained in instrumental terms. And the argument goes is this, that
We lost you for a second, Salman.
Okay. I'm just saying, so to prevent, so the idea of racism is that it divides the working class along racial lines, black and white, rather than uniting to fight against capitalism, they become divided and fight against each other. And in other words, racism and by extension Islamophobia is used for ulterior motives. Now behind this is the idea of of some sort of myth of puppet masters, people who are directing, who are not really true believers in either racism or Islamophobia, but simply use it as a tool for particular purposes. What I'd like to suggest to you is that perhaps we should think about racism and Islamophobia as being not the work of people who don't believe in it. In other words, I don't think these Islamophobes are simply detached from it. They are actually true believers. And in that sense, I would say to you that Islamophobia shouldn't simply be understood as in instrumental terms, but as critical to the formation of interests and identities of different subjects. In other words, Islamophobia isn't simply about, it doesn't have a purpose of its own. It doesn't have a purpose which extends to something else. Islamophobia is basically something about itself, in the sense that you have to be an Islamophobe to exercise Islamophobia. And what I want to do is really think a little bit about what that might be. So one way to understand Islamophobia, and I was listening very carefully to the previous presentation, and there was a sense in which the data from the ethnomethodologic data from Bengal pointed to the idea in which it was felt that minorities, i.e. Muslim minorities, were getting all the breaks. And you can see this phrase of that around in many parts of the world where it is assumed that the dispossessed Muslim minorities are the ones who are benefiting most from a corrupt ruling order. And that suggests to me that one way of thinking about Islamophobia is a form of revanchism, a form of revenge, and an attempt to reclaim a country that people think they have lost. Things ain't what they used to be, and the reason why things are not what they used to be is the presence of Muslims. Now, in some extent, you could argue, well, why Muslims? Because any other grouping could fulfill that purpose. But there's something specific about Muslimness, which I think is crucial to the expansion and development of Islamophobia at a planetary level. And that is that another way that I've talked about thinking about Islamophobia is really an attempt to regulate and discipline Muslimness by reference to a westernizing horizon. And what I mean is this, that a westernizing horizon is now hegemonic through the idea of modernity and modern prosperity, and therefore it becomes part of the neoliberal global settlement. That despite the variations in regimes, you now have an agreement or a consensus, despite what happened in 2008, or an internalization of neoliberal values and an internalization of neoliberal practices, so that one can only imagine the future in these neoliberal terms. But to be neoliberal, to be part of the process of neoliberal, you have to be modern. And modernity, despite the fact that it may be carried out in Japan or in China or elsewhere, has within it a kernel of westernization, of the idea that to be modern is in some way to follow a path pioneered by the West. In which case, to demonstrate your modern character, you have to expel what is backwards and what is holding back modernization or modernity itself. And because of the way that you can articulate Muslims as being anti-modern, it is possible to relocate the obstacles to modernity itself in relation to Muslimness. And which means that Muslims or Muslimness becomes a metaphor for the inability of the project of modernity to be fully itself. Now, this, I think, helps us to recognize at a conceptual level the commonalities between the various occurrences around Islamophobia. Islamophobia provides a surface of inscription on which the projects of the neoliberal, modernizing, westernizing future is written by saying that we reject Muslimness and all its various cognates. To close these remarks, I would just pick out two, and I've seen a lot of people have been talking about religion and the idea of Islam as a religion, and religion, of course, belongs to the past, not the future, and so therefore all the negative connotations which the Enlightenment had about religion become attached to Islam or Muslimness. But the other one is the very idea of a nation state. And the trouble with Muslims or Muslimness is that it cannot easily be contained within the boundaries of a nation state. Every single project of Islamophobia, wherever in the world, always tries to nationalize Muslimness. You can see this in Macron's France, where you have the closing down of autonomous Muslim organizations and the attempt to create a French Muslim authority structure which is beholden to the French state. So the nationalization of Islam, whether it's in governmental terms, administrative terms, or cultural terms, becomes one of the key ways in which Islamophobia is expressed. And this, I would say to you, is one of the key elements which explains the expansion of Islamophobia. In a world in which the nation state is becoming weaker in its ability to control its borders, to control its destiny, the anxiety of the nation state is heightened. At the same time, the ability of Muslimness not to be contained within the nation state becomes a way of concretizing that anxiety. So I would want to say to you is this, that to the extent that Muslimness escapes easy nationalization, it becomes a way of thinking of the crisis of the nation state itself. And this is why I think to link Islamophobia simply to countering violent extremism or the war on terror, without actually understanding that the real issue with Islamophobia isn't the war on terror, but the war to maintain the fiction of a nationally bounded entity and the demand that political subjectivity should only confine itself within national boundaries. And to the extent that Muslimness interrupts that kind of political subjectivity, it becomes both the source and the possibility of alternative forms of organization. So I want to conclude these remarks. It's been a long day, and I'm sure there are many things which have been engaging and interesting and learned through this process of the conference itself. The key component I would like to say is this, that ultimately Islamophobia is not really about ethical or moral failings of Islamophobes or those who are subject to Islamophobia. It seems to me what Islamophobia does is mask the possibility of those who are deemed to be people without history to claim the right to write their own history, in which case Islamophobia is ultimately about foreclosing the possibility of Muslim autonomy. And therefore, the resistance to Islamophobia is always going to be an advocacy and a deepening of efforts to allow for Muslimness to be autonomous. I think I'll stop there, Hatem, and
thank you, Salman. I'll bring everybody in here. So for us to conclude this session, and Uzma, it's really good to have you, Andrea, Ashwarya, and Sana. We only have one question that came up on the chat, which I will put in here for panelists, since laïcité is being used against not only Muslims. Do you think there are other groups we could reach out to that would support the fight for justice and freedom? So if anyone just wants to conclude us with either answering that question, so we don't leave the person that nobody attached or responded to them.
I think if you accept that the struggle for Islamophobia is a political struggle, then the idea of having allies is central to that, and I think there is it's not a question about reaching out to other groups and things like that. I think the work is already going on there. I think it's a question about understanding and mobilizing Muslims in relation to Islamophobia and understanding what the threat Islamophobia poses to them, even if they feel that they don't experience it. And I think there are many, many kind of markers of that. So I would say that we shouldn't really be concerned, are there specific groups, because that would change at a particular kind of context. But the most important thing is that we don't allow Islamophobia to be contained in the boundaries set by Islamophobes, and we don't allow the campaigns against Islamophobia to be so contained. And I think that's really, really the key issue, because it's only by transcending those national boundaries that it seems to me that Islamophobia can be resisted, and there will be many people of good faith or no faith who will actually understand that the regulation of Muslimness is transforming relations between state and citizen, and therefore it's in everyone's interest to combat Islamophobia, not just Muslims.
Thank you. Andrea, go ahead. Just unmute.
Yes, no, thank you. I just wanted to add something from my part. I think also that we should reflect on the place of the sacred and religion and spirituality, because within epistemology, for example, because I think there is a big problem of exclusion of that in, for example, in science. So it would be important to rethink the place of religion, the place of spirituality, the place of that, not as against scientific thought. That would be my remark from what I've been working on.
Philip, do you have last minute just conclusion so we could wrap up this last panel?
Sure, yeah. It definitely comes out to reaching out to other community organizations that are working to educate, and education is a huge part of this, and being able to bring this awareness to the masses. It's definitely in the media that these things are going on. It's becoming more reported on that Islamophobic incidences are happening, and as was mentioned earlier, they seem to be on the rise here in Canada. And just having that proper coverage, not a biased or Islamophobic kind of twist on that coverage, is also an important aspect to try and have this available to everyone and have it accessible. The idea of being in the academic ivory tower and we're kind of talking amongst ourselves, I definitely see that we need to have this more engagement with the general population rather than kind of conversing amongst ourselves. It's great and everything, but with reports such as CARE that come out with the Islamophobia reports, these are accessible, and these are the kind of the frontline means that we can bring to the general population.
Sana, you have a minute.
I would just say that it is important to take seriously the idea of religion and to engage with the religious sensibilities. For instance, why certain elements, certain articles of faith, certain ideologies, certain ideas, certain say symbols are important to a particular religious community. I think in order to combat Islamophobia, it's important to understand and engage with the other. So I think engaging with the other would be something I would take away from. Yeah, thank you.
Ashwarya, 1 minute to conclude.
I think I'll probably just echo what Sana said. So I'm just going to take 5 seconds. We've got to have shared spaces. We've just got to speak to each other. I don't know what is so baffling about this, because I'm not a Muslim myself. It took me good 10 years to realize the Muslim is an other. And, that's what I'm saying in terms of the government we presently have in India. It's kind of a drilling process to make you realize that, you're not you're not same as them, and they're an enemy, and it's so easy to do. So maybe shared spaces will not be that difficult either. Just reverse the process. long battle, but yeah, why not? Also, just 1 second, I need to mention Mr. Kamal Khan. He's an NTV journalist we recently lost, and his long-term project has been communal harmony. So yeah, just to mention that. Thank you so much.
I just want to clarify that the politics in India is making the Muslims the other, not that we consider the Muslims. So, Ozma?
I don't really have anything new to add. I think just in thinking in the Quebec context, there are a number of groups that are working together to challenge Bill 21, not only Muslims, so not only other religious groups. So CCLA, the Sikh community, and any number of other teachers unions are all working together in terms of challenging the bill.
Thank you. So thank you all for participating. Thanks the earlier panels, the speakers from the first panel, Jasmine, Huzaifa, all of you that have joined us. This is a non-stop research and conversation, as well as sharing the data and information. So if you're working on any project that you think would benefit the collective work on Islamophobia, by all means, communicate with us, and we look forward to seeing you in future iterations. So we conclude the 8th Paris Islamophobia Conference, and we look forward to the next year, as well as the International Islamophobia Studies and Research Association Conference, which will be in May, and we will be sending this information out soon as well. So thank you, and stay healthy, stay well, and Assalamu alaikum.